Hello and welcome. I know many of you use these videos to help you fall asleep. So before we begin, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also comment where you're from and at what time you're watching. Take a moment to get comfortable, relax, and let yourself unwind. It was a rainy evening when young Emma received the doll. Her mother had picked it up during one of her trips, promising that it would be a special gift for her daughter. The doll was exquisite, its porcelain skin smooth and flawless, its eyes an eerie shade of deep green that seemed to follow Emma wherever she went. It was dressed in a delicate blue dress, with lace trim and tiny buttons that sparkled in the dim light of the living room. "Look what I got for you, darling," her mother said with a warm smile, setting the doll in Emma's lap. "I thought you'd like her." Emma stared at the doll for a moment, feeling an inexplicable shiver crawl up her spine. It was beautiful, yes, but something about it unsettled her. The way its eyes seemed to blink when she wasn't looking directly at it, or the way it tilted its head slightly when she moved. But she kept her thoughts to herself, not wanting to disappoint her mother. "Thank you, Mom," Emma said softly, trying to push the uncomfortable feeling away. Her mother kissed her on the forehead and went back to the kitchen, leaving Emma alone with her new doll. As the clock on the wall ticked louder in the silence, Emma gently rocked the doll back and forth in her arms. That's when she noticed it. The doll's tiny fingers twitched. Startled, Emma looked closer. Her heartbeat quickened as the doll's eyes locked onto hers with an intensity she hadn't noticed before. It wasn't just staring at her, it was watching her, waiting. "That's silly," Emma muttered to herself. "It's just a doll. It can't really move on its own." But as the minutes passed, the doll's eyes seemed to blink in rhythm with her own movements. Emma's breath caught in her throat. She shook her head, trying to rid herself of the strange feeling growing inside her. She placed the doll carefully on her bed, stood up, and went to the window to watch the rain splatter against the glass. The wind howled outside, causing the trees to bend and sway. The world felt far away, like it existed in some separate space. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. It was probably nothing, just her imagination. But as she turned to go back to her bed, she froze. The doll had moved. It wasn't in the same position as before. Its tiny porcelain arms were now resting on the edge of the bed, as though it had crawled there. "Mom!" Emma shouted, her voice shaking. But no answer came from downstairs. The house felt quieter than usual, like the air itself was holding its breath. Emma slowly approached the doll. The unease grew with every step, and she was almost afraid to touch it. But she couldn't leave it there. Reaching out, she picked up the doll and quickly set it back in its original spot. The moment she did, she noticed something even stranger. A faint clicking sound like gears turning coming from inside the doll. Emma's heart pounded in her chest. "What is going on with you?" she whispered to the doll, but it gave no answer. That night, she couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard the clicking sound, like little gears turning inside the doll's body. And every time she peeked over at it, the doll's eyes seemed just a little more alive. Emma lay in bed, her eyes fixed on the clock as the minutes ticked by. The clicking noise continued to echo in her mind, but when she glanced over at the doll, it was still sitting motionless on the bed. Her heart raced, and she pulled the covers tightly around her. Maybe she was just imagining things, she thought. It had to be the storm, the wind, or the shadows playing tricks on her. But then, just as she was about to drift off, she heard it again, a soft, deliberate click. It wasn't coming from the clock this time. It was coming from the doll. Her breath caught in her throat. She dared not move, but the sound grew louder, more distinct, as though something inside the doll was winding up. Slowly, ever so slowly, Emma lifted her head and turned to face the bed. The doll's head had tilted to one side, its eyes wide open, staring directly at her. But that wasn't all. The doll's tiny porcelain hand was moving. Not much, just enough for her to notice. It was reaching toward her, its fingers flexing, as if it were alive. Stop it, Emma whispered to herself, her voice barely audible. She wasn't sure whether she was talking to the doll or to her own racing thoughts. But the doll didn't stop. Its fingers curled slightly, and its head tilted further, as if beckoning her closer. Emma pulled the blanket up over her head, her pulse quickening. She couldn't keep her eyes closed for long, though. Every time she tried, the image of the doll haunted her mind. Its staring eyes, its strange, almost human movements, there was no escaping it. Suddenly, she heard the doll's voice, a soft, metallic, almost musical voice. "Emma," it said, its tone sweet but eerily mechanical. Emma's eyes snapped open. The words echoed in her head, but the room was still dark and silent. Her heart thumped wildly in her chest as she slowly lifted the blanket away, staring at the doll. It was still sitting there, perfectly still, with no sign that it had just spoken. "Emma," the voice repeated, clearer this time, almost as if it was coming from inside the doll's chest. Her hands trembled as she reached for the doll, her heart racing. "This isn't real," she whispered, her voice shaking. "You're just a doll, a toy." But when she touched its cold porcelain arm, it felt strangely warm. Her fingers brushed over its surface, and she felt the gears inside shifting. The doll's eyes seemed to blink, and she pulled her hand back quickly. Who are you?" Emma asked, her voice quivering, but the room remained silent once again. The doll didn't answer. Instead, it tilted its head back and forth, its eyes still fixed on Emma with that same unnerving stare. That night, Emma didn't sleep at all. She lay awake, listening to the rain pounding against the windows, to the distant sounds of the house creaking, and to the strange ticking coming from the doll. The next morning, she found it sitting on her desk, just as she had left it on the bed. She rubbed her eyes, trying to clear the fog from her mind. It was early, the house was still quiet, and her mother hadn't come in to check on her yet. But the sight of the doll sitting innocently on her desk made her heart race again. No, it couldn't be real. It had to be her imagination. Her mother had said it was a special doll, a one-of-a-kind creation. Maybe it had some mechanism inside that made it seem like it was moving. But no matter how much she tried to convince herself, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. She reached over and touched the doll again, this time braver than before. Its cold surface felt smooth, but something was different. The gears inside seemed to click and turn more rapidly now. It wasn't just moving its hands. Now, the entire body seemed to be subtly shifting, as though it was trying to stand up. "Stop!" Emma gasped, pulling her hand away. The doll's head jerked slightly, its eyes blinking faster. The air around her felt heavy, as though the very room was holding its breath. That's when it happened. The doll's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Instead, a thin thread of black smoke began to pour from its mouth. The smoke was so dark it seemed to swallow the light around it. Emma stumbled back, knocking over a book on her desk as she scrambled to her feet. Her breath caught in her throat, and she stumbled back toward the door. "What do you want from me?" she whispered, her voice breaking. The smoke seemed to grow thicker, swirling around the room. Then, without warning, the doll moved again. This time, it didn't just twitch or shift. It stood up, its delicate porcelain feet clicking against the wood floor. Slowly, it turned its head toward Emma, its eyes glowing with an unnatural green light. The air felt colder now, as though something sinister had entered the room. Emma felt her heart pounding in her chest as she backed away. But the doll didn't stop. It took a slow step forward, then another, moving toward her with unnatural precision. "Stay away!" Emma shouted, her voice rising in panic. The doll's tiny feet continued their steady, rhythmic clicking as it moved closer and closer. Each step echoed in Emma's ears, and she felt as if the world was closing in on her. No matter how fast she backed away, the doll followed her, its movements smooth, almost too smooth. When she reached the corner of the room, she could go no further. She pressed herself against the wall, her heart hammering in her chest. The doll reached out its hand again, its fingers curling toward Emma's wrist. "Come with me," the doll's voice said, its tone sweet but cold. Emma's breath hitched in her throat. The doll's fingers were just inches from her wrist, its small hand reaching with an unnatural precision. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body refused to obey. It was as if the very air around her was thick with something heavy, something suffocating. "No," she whispered, the word trembling on her lips. She tried to move, but her legs felt frozen, as though the ground beneath her had turned to stone. The doll's smile widened, stretching unnaturally across its porcelain face. It wasn't a smile of joy or warmth. It was cold, empty, like something pretending to be kind but hiding a dark, malicious intent. "Come with me," it repeated, its voice laced with an eerie sweetness. "Come play." The black smoke that had been drifting out of its mouth thickened, curling around Emma's feet like tendrils of darkness. She couldn't breathe. It was as though the room had shrunk, the walls closing in around her. Every instinct told her to run, but the doll's eyes, those green, piercing eyes, held her captive. It was watching her every move, reading her fear. Her hand shot out instinctively, and she slapped the doll away. It fell to the floor with a soft thud, its delicate form bouncing slightly before it landed face up. For a moment, the room was silent, but only for a moment. A low, mechanical clicking sound filled the room, followed by another, and then another. The doll wasn't just moving, it was reacting, as though it had a mind of its own. Its body jerked violently, its head snapping back and forth in sharp, unsettling movements. Emma gasped as she watched it slowly sit up, its small hands lifting from the floor, moving as if to stand again. The gears inside it were grinding, turning, as if the doll itself was struggling to break free from some invisible restraint. "Stop!" Emma cried, her voice rising in desperation. "Stop it! Stop moving!" But the doll didn't listen. It couldn't listen. With a sudden lurch, the doll stood again, its body shifting like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. It tilted its head, staring at Emma with that unblinking gaze. Then, with unnerving calmness, it began to speak again. "Play with me, Emma," it said. "Play forever." Emma took another step back, feeling the cold press against her skin, her heart pounding faster than ever. The room was closing in. She had no idea what it wanted, or why it had chosen her. But she knew one thing: she had to get out. She had to escape. But the doll was already moving toward her again. Step by slow step, its tiny feet clicking rhythmically across the floor, its head bobbing as it approached. The room seemed to grow colder with every movement. The smoke had thickened, now swirling in dark clouds that seemed to reach out toward her, like hands trying to grab hold of her. "Please," Emma gasped, her voice pleading. "Please, leave me alone." But the doll didn't stop. It reached out its hand once more, its tiny fingers curling toward her wrist with a deliberate slowness, as though savoring the moment. Emma could feel the coldness in the air, the heaviness pressing down on her chest. Her vision blurred with panic, her hands shaking as she stepped backward, her mind racing for an escape. But the wall behind her was the end. She had nowhere to go. Her breath caught in her throat as the doll's fingers touched her skin. It wasn't just cold, it was freezing, like ice sinking into her veins. The sensation sent a shock through her body, and she yanked her arm away, staggering to the side. "No! No, no, no!" Emma cried, her voice cracking with fear. She grabbed the first thing she could, a heavy book from her desk, and swung it at the doll, aiming for its head. The book collided with its porcelain face with a sharp crack. For a moment, the doll's head snapped back, its body going limp as if it had been knocked unconscious. Emma stood panting, her pulse racing as she stared at the doll, waiting for it to move again. But for the first time, it remained still. No clicking, no whispers. Just silence. She didn't wait to find out if it would stay that way. With shaking hands, she grabbed the doll by its tiny arm and shoved it into the bottom of her closet. slamming the door shut with a force that rattled the walls. She leaned against the door, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Her mind raced. What was happening? How had something so small, so delicate, become so terrifying? What did the doll want? Why was it after her? Emma's thoughts raced, but there was only one thing she could think of now: getting away from that thing. She didn't know how long she could keep it locked away, but she couldn't stay in the room any longer. She stumbled toward the door, her hands trembling as she reached for the doorknob. But before she could open it, she heard the unmistakable sound of something clicking from inside the closet. The doll wasn't still anymore. A soft, rhythmic tapping echoed from behind the door, followed by a faint scraping sound. The doll wasn't just sitting there. It was moving. Emma froze, her heart in her throat. The sound was getting louder, closer. It was coming toward the door. She didn't know what it was going to do. She didn't know what it could do. But she knew one thing for certain: she couldn't let it out. She backed away slowly, her eyes glued to the closet door. The clicking sound grew faster, as if the doll was getting closer with every passing second. The sound from the closet was unmistakable now. A steady, unyielding click, like the turning of gears, rhythmic and mechanical, but far more disturbing. Each tap sent chills racing down Emma's spine. The air in the room seemed to grow colder, heavier, and her breath became shallow as she pressed herself against the far wall, her heart hammering in her chest. She hadn't dared to open the door to check. She didn't want to know what the doll was doing. She didn't even want to imagine what it might be capable of. It was already beyond anything she had ever seen or felt before. The clicking continued, now joined by another sound, a scraping, like nails dragging across wood. Emma's eyes darted from the closet door to the window. The storm outside, now a violent cacophony of howling winds and torrential rain. If she could just get outside, away from the house, she could escape. But the closet door rattled, pulling her focus back to the doll. The noise intensified, faster, more frantic, as though the doll was getting closer to the door, desperately trying to get out. "Please," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible over the sounds of the storm. "Please, just stop." She reached for the doorknob, her hands shaking violently. Maybe if she could lock the closet from the outside, she could get away. But the knob wouldn't turn. The handle was frozen, as though the wood itself had seized up. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, to get out of the house, but she couldn't move. The thought of facing that doll again, feeling those cold fingers reach for her, it paralyzed her. Then, without warning, the closet door creaked. The air around her felt colder, almost like ice was settling in the room. The doll had begun to move again, faster now, as though it had been wound too tight and was now breaking free. The sound of its small, delicate feet clicking against the floor was louder, sharper. The doll was no longer inside the closet. It was out. It was in the room. It was right behind her. Emma whipped around, her heart pounding so loudly it almost drowned out the sound of the clicking. There, standing in the doorway of the closet, was the doll. It was no longer sitting, no longer gently moving its head. It was standing completely upright. Its tiny feet clicked against the hardwood floor as it slowly stepped forward. Its eyes glowed bright green now, that unnerving, unblinking gaze fixed directly on Emma. It was silent, but its presence was suffocating. The doll seemed to pulse with energy like a living thing as it glided closer to her, its tiny hand extending toward her. "Why are you doing this?" Emma gasped, stepping back as the doll's hand reached out. She could feel the coldness of its touch from across the room, an unnatural chill that seemed to seep into her very bones. "Play with me, Emma," the doll said again, its voice sweet but chilling, like a lullaby gone horribly wrong. "Play forever." Emma took another step back, her breath coming in ragged bursts. There was no room left for her to run. She had nowhere to go. "Please, I just want to be left alone," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "I didn't ask for this. I didn't want any of this." But the doll didn't stop. Its hand was now mere inches from her skin. It reached out as if it could take hold of her, claiming her, pulling her into its endless game. And as its fingers brushed against her wrist, Emma felt a jolt, a shock like electricity running through her veins. Her vision blurred, her head spinning as though the room itself was twisting around her. The doll's smile widened. Emma couldn't move. The coldness of the doll's touch spread through her body, creeping into her chest, her limbs, freezing her in place. The gears inside the doll clicked faster now, each turn accompanied by a low metallic hum. The doll wasn't just touching her, it was controlling her, pulling her into its grasp, drawing her into its world of twisted gears and unending silence. And then something inside Emma snapped. She wasn't sure what it was, whether it was the sheer terror or the overwhelming sense of helplessness, but something inside her finally broke free. She shoved the doll away with all her strength, pushing it to the ground. For a brief moment, she saw it falter, its porcelain body falling backward, its gears grinding in protest. But Emma didn't wait to see what it would do next. She turned and ran. She didn't know where to go, but she knew she had to get out of that room, out of that house, away from the doll. The sound of her footsteps echoed through the house, louder than ever. She could hear the rain pounding against the windows, the wind howling outside, but in that moment, it all seemed so distant, so unimportant. Her eyes darted down the hallway as she ran, searching for any way out, but the house seemed to stretch forever. The walls were too close, the doorways too far, and behind her, the unmistakable click of the doll's feet echoed in the distance. "Emma," it called, its voice distant but still too close for comfort. "Come back, Emma. Come play." She didn't look back. She couldn't. But she could feel it, feel the doll's presence, its cold fingers reaching for her, just waiting to catch up. She turned down the stairs, nearly tripping on the last step, her heart racing as she bolted toward the front door. But when she reached for the doorknob, her blood ran cold. The door wouldn't open. It was locked, no more than that, it was sealed shut. She twisted the knob again and again, desperate to escape, but it was as if the house itself was holding her in. The sound of the doll's clicking feet was growing louder. It was getting closer. Emma could hear its soft, mechanical voice, almost right behind her now. "Come play, Emma," it repeated, its voice growing more insistent. "Come play with me forever." Emma's hands trembled as she pounded against the door, her mind racing for any possible escape. But it was too late. She could already feel the doll's cold presence right behind her, its tiny fingers grazing her skin. And then silence. The silence was suffocating. The wind outside howled in desperation, but within the house, everything had come to a halt. Emma stood frozen, her hands still gripping the doorknob, her entire body tense, waiting for the next sound, the next movement. She didn't dare to look over her shoulder. She could feel the doll's presence, the cold that seemed to radiate from its very being. Every instinct told her to move, to run, to do something, anything, but her limbs were paralyzed. The air was thick with an invisible pressure, as if the very house itself was watching her, waiting for her next move. Her mind raced, desperately searching for an answer, for a way out, but there was nothing. The doll's voice echoed in her ears, distant but unmistakably real, as if it was now inside her head, whispering to her. "Play with me." Emma's heart beat faster, her pulse racing. She couldn't breathe. The walls of the house seemed to close in on her, suffocating her in a way she had never felt before. It wasn't just fear. It was something deeper, something far more ancient and terrifying. Suddenly, she heard the softest click. Her breath caught in her throat. And then another, and another. The clicking was no longer distant. It was right behind her. With a burst of instinct, Emma turned around, her eyes wide with terror, her entire body trembling. She wasn't prepared for what she saw. There, standing just inches away from her, was the doll. Its small, delicate form glimmered in the dim light of the hallway. But it wasn't just standing. Its body was moving again, jerking and twitching like a marionette on tangled strings. Its head bobbed in unnatural movements, and the gears inside it turned violently, clicking and grinding as if it was malfunctioning. "Play," it whispered again, its voice far more sinister now, no longer sweet, but hollow, like a broken record playing over and over. "Play forever." Emma stumbled back, her heart thundering in her chest, her legs weak from fear. She tried to scream, but the words caught in her throat. The doll took another step toward her, its eyes wide and unblinking, its grin stretched impossibly wide. It was alive. It was real. And it wasn't just mimicking her movements anymore. It was controlling her. The doll raised its hand toward her again, this time not in a gesture of play, but in a chilling command. Its fingers were cold, stiff, and unyielding, and as they touched Emma's skin, she felt the shock of its touch shoot through her body. She couldn't pull away. Her limbs were frozen, her body locked in place, and her mind screamed for release, but there was nothing she could do. "Play with me," it said again, and the words echoed in her mind, over and over, louder with each repetition. "Play forever, Emma." The walls of the house seemed to distort, to bend and twist as though they were alive, as if the house itself was part of the doll's twisted game. Emma's vision blurred, the room spinning, and she felt herself being pulled deeper into the doll's nightmare. She was no longer in control of her body. It was as if the doll's hand was directing her every movement, every breath. Suddenly, the house seemed to stretch infinitely, the hallway stretching on for miles. The walls began to close in, and the floor seemed to rise, twisting like a winding staircase. Emma's world was warping, bending, as if the very fabric of reality was crumbling around her. The doll's hand never let go, its fingers curling tighter around her wrist. "Come with me," it said, its voice no longer a request, but an order. "Come and play. Forever." Desperation surged through Emma, and with all her strength, she broke free. She yanked her arm away from the doll's icy grasp, stumbling backward, her heart racing as she turned to run. But the house had changed. The hallway she had known was no longer there. It was dark, unnaturally dark, the walls now lined with strange, unfamiliar symbols. The floors creaked beneath her feet, and the air felt thick with the smell of dust and decay. It was like she had stepped into a different place altogether, one that had no connection to the world she knew. Her mind was reeling. What had happened to her house? Why was everything so wrong? The doll was still behind her, its movements now unnervingly smooth, as though it was no longer bound by the same mechanical limitations. It was more than a doll. It was something else entirely. A creature, a thing that existed beyond the constraints of the world Emma knew. Her eyes scanned the darkness, desperately searching for an escape. She had to get out. She had to. The clicking sound was growing louder, more rapid. It was closing in on her, the doll gaining ground. Emma could feel it now, a presence in the air, something far larger than just the doll. It was as though the entire house was alive, watching her, waiting. And then, from somewhere deep in the shadows, she heard a voice. "Help me." It was soft, a whisper, but it carried an unmistakable urgency. Emma froze, her heart skipping a beat. The voice was familiar. She knew that voice. She turned toward the sound, her eyes wide with dread. "Help me, Emma." The voice came again, clearer this time, and Emma's stomach twisted. It was coming from inside the walls. Her breath quickened, her pulse pounding in her ears. The doll's clicking grew louder, faster, its presence almost suffocating. And then she saw it, a figure in the shadows, standing motionless just beyond the edge of her vision. A pale, ghostly face staring at her with wide, unblinking eyes. Its mouth moved, but no sound came. The figure stepped forward, its body jerking with the same mechanical, lifeless movements as the doll. It was her own reflection. The figure reached out, its hands stretching toward Emma, its fingers twitching as if it wanted to touch her. And then, with a sharp, sudden noise, the doll lunged forward, its cold hand gripping Emma's wrist again, dragging her into the shadows. The clicking sound echoed in her mind, the whispering voice of the figure growing louder, becoming a chant, repeating the same words over and over. Help me play forever. The world around Emma was a blur of shadows and disorienting sounds. The walls seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, bending and stretching as though they were alive, moving to the rhythm of the doll's eerie clicking. The doll's grip on her wrist tightened, its cold fingers digging into her flesh, pulling her deeper into the darkness. Please, please, stop! Emma gasped, her voice hoarse, desperate. But the doll didn't respond. It only clicked faster, its tiny mechanical limbs moving with an inhuman precision as it dragged her through the house. The shadowy figure, the one that had once been her reflection, hovered just out of her reach, watching with those hollow, unblinking eyes. Its mouth moved, silently chanting something that Emma couldn't quite understand. But the words, the rhythm of the chant, began to take root in her mind. The chant echoed, growing louder, more insistent. Forever, play forever. Emma's chest tightened as she realized what it meant. The house wasn't just alive. It was trapped, and she was the one that was supposed to play. She was the one being drawn in, becoming a part of whatever nightmare this place had become. The doll led her through dark corridors that twisted like a maze. The house seemed to be alive, shifting around her, disorienting her further with each turn. The only sounds were the incessant clicking of the doll's joints and the low hum of gears turning inside it. Her thoughts were muddled, her mind struggling to keep up with the flood of panic coursing through her. She couldn't focus. Everything was out of place, out of sync. The house was moving, the doll was moving, and the shadowy figure was waiting. "Play with me," the doll said, its voice chillingly sweet, but there was a malevolence behind it now, a sinister undertone that made Emma shudder. Play forever. She couldn't let it take her, couldn't let it trap her here. But every step she took felt heavier, as if the very air was pressing down on her, making it harder and harder to breathe. The walls loomed closer, the shadows stretched out farther, and the doll clicked, moving faster. Suddenly, the house grew silent. The air froze. Emma stopped, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. The doll had stopped moving too, its small, delicate form completely still. She turned slowly, eyes darting around, searching for any sign of movement. And then she heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper, but it wasn't from the doll. It came from the walls. Help me, Emma." It was the same voice as before, the one that had called to her from the shadows. Emma's heart skipped a beat. She knew that voice. She had heard it somewhere before, but where? Who are you?" she whispered, her voice barely a breath. The whisper came again, clearer this time. "Help me before it's too late." The walls shifted, the shadows deepened, and the temperature in the room plummeted. Emma felt a cold breath against her skin, like icy fingers brushing across her face. "Who are you?" she repeated, her voice growing stronger, desperate. This time, the voice responded. "I am." But before the voice could continue, the doll jerked violently, its eyes flashing with a bright, unnatural light. The clicking sound resumed, faster, louder, like a ticking time bomb, each click sending a wave of panic through Emma's chest. "No! No!" Emma shouted, backing away from the doll as it advanced toward her once more. "Leave me alone. I don't want to play anymore." But the doll didn't stop. It reached out with one cold, mechanical hand, and Emma was pulled forward once more, her feet stumbling over the floor as she tried to resist. The voice from the shadows, now frantic, shouted, "Run, Emma, run!" The words jolted through her, filling her with a burst of energy. Without thinking, Emma tore herself away from the doll's grasp, spinning on her heel and bolting down the hallway. The clicking of the doll's feet echoed behind her, growing louder and faster with each step. The house twisted, the walls closing in as she ran. The doors were gone, the windows sealed shut, and the air was thick with the overwhelming sense of being watched. The shadows pressed in around her, suffocating her with their presence. She didn't know where she was running to, or if there was any hope of escape. But she had to keep moving. She had to find a way out. Ahead of her, the walls parted just enough for her to slip through, opening into a small, dimly lit room. The air was heavy with dust and decay, the floor covered in thick cobwebs. It felt like an old, forgotten part of the house, a place that time had abandoned. But something was wrong with this room. The shadows seemed deeper, the air colder. And there, in the center of the room, stood an old, tarnished mirror. Its surface was cracked, shards of glass scattered around it, but the reflection staring back at Emma was not her own. The figure in the mirror was her, but not. The face was pale and hollow, eyes wide and empty. Its mouth was twisted into a grin, and its body was covered in strange symbols that glowed faintly in the dim light. The reflection didn't move. It only stared at Emma, its hollow eyes boring into her soul. Emma's breath caught in her throat. What is this?" she whispered, reaching out toward the mirror. And then, with a sudden, sharp motion, the figure in the mirror lifted its hand and touched the glass. The glass rippled, as if the surface were liquid, and Emma froze in terror. The figure in the mirror reached through, its cold fingers brushing against the real Emma's skin. A scream tore through her throat as the world around her began to twist and distort. The doll's clicking grew louder, faster, like 1,000 gears turning at once. The shadows seemed to stretch, pulling her into the mirror, and she was helpless, powerless to stop it. And then, in the blink of an eye, she was no longer in the room. She was somewhere else, somewhere dark and cold. A place where time didn't exist. A place where the doll could play with her forever. Emma's surroundings shifted again, and she was no longer in the small, dim room with the broken mirror. The world around her had turned into something even darker, more disorienting. The air was thick and heavy, like the space had no oxygen, suffocating her with an oppressive weight. Her heart hammered in her chest, and she felt an overwhelming sense of dread that she couldn't shake off. She stood in a place that defied logic. Nothing around her made sense. The walls were made of blackened wood, twisted and gnarled, as if the house itself had decayed into something monstrous. The floor beneath her feet was uneven, rough, and every step she took echoed like thunder in the silence. The clicking of the doll's feet, sharp and mechanical, was the only sound that filled the air. It was like a countdown, a clock ticking down to some inevitable end. Emma turned in circles, trying to make sense of her surroundings, but it was impossible. She felt trapped in a nightmare, the very fabric of reality unraveling around her. "Where am I?" she whispered, her voice barely breaking the stillness. She knew the answer deep down. It didn't matter where she was. It was the same place. The same house, the same curse. Then, behind her, came the sound of a creak, slow and deliberate. She spun around to find the doll standing there, its tiny body just a few feet away, its glass eyes glinting with malevolent intent. "You shouldn't have run," the doll said, its voice now a harsh, mechanical rasp. It was no longer a sweet invitation to play. Now it was a warning. "You can't escape." Emma's pulse raced as she stumbled backward, her body shaking. She had no escape. The walls were closing in again, the air growing colder, and the doll's presence felt suffocating. The house was alive, and it was hungry. Hungry for her soul, for her to become another piece of its twisted game. "You're part of me now," the doll continued, its voice still echoing through her mind. "Once you've played, you'll never stop." "No!" Emma cried out, her voice breaking. She reached for the door, but it slammed shut before she could even touch the handle. The walls rattled, the floor groaned, and she realized, with rising terror, that she was no longer in control. The house, this thing, was toying with her, drawing her deeper into its nightmare. With a desperate scream, she turned and ran toward the only source of light, the faint glow that seemed to come from nowhere, illuminating the center of the room. It was a table, simple in appearance but wrong in every way. On it was something she couldn't bear to look at. It was a clock that didn't belong. Its hands spun wildly, twisting in impossible directions, ticking erratically as if the very flow of time had been twisted in the house's grip. But it wasn't the clock that made Emma's stomach churn. It was the thing sitting at the table, its face covered in shadow, its body made of intricately carved wood, like the doll, like her. It was another doll, but it was larger, its body cracked and chipped, and its eyes were hollow pits, black as the void itself. "Do you understand now, Emma?" The doll's voice croaked, though its mouth didn't move. It was the same voice as the first doll, but this time it felt like it was inside her head, speaking directly to her thoughts. "You are me, and I am you." Emma took a step back, her mind reeling. It was all connected, all of it. The doll, the house, the whispers. She had been drawn into something ancient, something cursed. And now she was a part of it, a piece of its endless game, a game that had no end. No, I'm not like you," Emma choked out, her eyes burning with tears. "I won't become like you." But the doll's hollow eyes seemed to see through her, to the very core of her soul. It tilted its head, a small creak coming from its neck as it regarded her with an unsettling, almost knowing expression. "You already have," the doll whispered. "You were always meant to play." Suddenly, the clock began to chime. The deep, resonant sound of each toll rattled the house, vibrating through the walls, through Emma's very bones. Each chime sent a shockwave of fear through her, each one a reminder that time was running out, that she was running out of time. The ticking was louder now, almost deafening, each second marking her descent into the doll's twisted world. She turned and ran again, her legs moving on instinct as the darkness closed in around her. The ticking followed her, louder and more frantic, a maddening rhythm that echoed through her mind. She didn't know where she was going, only that she couldn't stop. The walls loomed around her, the corridors stretching on endlessly, the air thick with the sense of being pursued. "Play with me forever," the words whispered again, louder this time, until they felt like a physical presence pressing against her. The doll was everywhere, watching, waiting. It was alive, more than just a doll. It was the embodiment of the curse, the twisted creature that controlled the house, the very thing that had ensnared Emma from the moment she touched it. She stumbled through the darkness, her breath ragged, her heart a thunderous drumbeat in her chest. Her eyes scanned the room for any sign of an escape, any way out, but there was nothing. There was only the endless, looping corridors, the walls that seemed to close in tighter with each passing second, and the sound of the clock, the ticking that had become a maddening, unrelenting force in her mind. Then, through the darkness, she saw it. A door. The first real door she had seen since the nightmare began. It was cracked open, a faint light spilling from the gap. Without thinking, Emma rushed toward it. Her hand gripped the doorknob, her fingers trembling, her heart in her throat. She yanked it open, and what she saw on the other side made her freeze. It was a room, her room. The same room she had woken up in that morning. The same room she had been in before the doll, before everything had spiraled out of control. But something was wrong. The walls were lined with the same carvings she had seen in the house, symbols she hadn't noticed before, twisting and shifting on their own. The bed was there, but the sheets were stained with dark marks, like dried blood. And sitting on the bed was the doll. The same doll with its cold, unblinking eyes. It was waiting. "Play with me," it whispered again, its voice sweet, yet chilling. "Forever." Emma's breath caught in her throat as she stood in the doorway, the world around her spinning, threatening to collapse under the weight of the doll's voice. The room in front of her, the one that had once been her sanctuary, now felt like a prison. Her room was no longer just a bedroom. It was an extension of the curse, a place where the nightmare had been waiting for her, patiently biding its time until she was too far gone to escape. The doll, now sitting motionless on the bed, seemed almost too still. It was as though it was waiting for something, waiting for her to make the first move. Its glass eyes glinted in the dim light, and its small mouth stretched into an impossibly wide grin, revealing rows of sharp, needle-like teeth. The sight of it made Emma's stomach churn. The doll was no longer just an object. It was alive, aware, and it wanted her. Without thinking, she took a step back, her feet stumbling against the floor as the terror clawed at her chest. The door behind her slammed shut with a deafening crash, trapping her inside. The room was now completely dark, the only light coming from the flickering, sickly glow of the doll's eyes. The clicking noise from before had stopped, but in its place, the sound of something much worse filled the room. A soft, almost imperceptible whisper like the fluttering of paper, but it was everywhere, inside her head, in her bones, in the very air she breathed. "You belong to me now," the voice hissed, and Emma's blood ran cold. "You will play forever." Emma's mind raced, trying to find any trace of rational thought, any way to break free. She didn't want to be part of this game anymore. She couldn't be a part of it. But the doll, it was everywhere, every corner of the room, every flicker of shadow, every creak of the floorboards. There was nowhere left to run. She backed into the corner, her heart pounding so loudly it drowned out everything else. The walls, once familiar, now seemed to close in on her, the darkness pressing tighter, as if it were alive. The symbols on the walls shifted again, their lines twisting and warping, sending ripples through the very fabric of the room. The doll moved. At first, it was just a slight twitch, then another. Its tiny head tilted to one side, and Emma could hear the gears inside it turning, slow, deliberate. She watched, her body frozen, as the doll slowly rose from the bed. Its mechanical joints creaked, and its eyes never left her, staring with a malevolent hunger. "No," Emma whispered, shaking her head, her voice trembling. "No, please. I don't want to play." The doll's grin widened, its tiny hands reaching toward her, the fingers slow and deliberate, as if savoring each moment of her fear. "You will play," it said again, its voice sickly sweet. "Forever." Emma's body moved without thinking. She scrambled to the bed, her hands shaking as she tried to pull the covers away, searching for something, anything, that could help her. But the bed was just as empty as before. There was nothing there, no escape. The doll was right behind her now, its tiny footsteps almost inaudible, until it stood directly beside her, its cold, unfeeling presence pressing against her side. She could feel its gaze on her, the coldness of its body radiating into her skin. "You're just a doll," Emma whispered, almost to herself. "Just a doll." But the doll's lips twisted into a cruel smile. "I am more than a doll," it whispered, its voice like an insect crawling through her mind. "I am you, and you are me." Suddenly, the doll's hand reached out, wrapping around Emma's wrist with a strength that made her gasp. It was cold, its mechanical fingers digging into her skin, the joints grinding together in a horrible metallic sound. "No!" Emma screamed, trying to pull away, but the doll's grip tightened, and the world around her began to spin. The darkness consumed her vision, and for a moment she lost all sense of where she was, her body feeling weightless, as if she were floating in an endless void. The sound of ticking filled her ears again, louder than ever before, the rhythm of it pounding in her skull. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the darkness vanished. Emma gasped for air, her hands gripping the floor beneath her. She was on the ground now, not in her room, but somewhere else. The walls were bare, made of cold stone, and the air was thick with the smell of mold and decay. She pushed herself up, her body trembling, but she couldn't escape the feeling that she was still trapped. And then she heard it again, the clicking. The doll had followed her. It was standing in the doorway, its small, wooden body outlined by the dim light, its eyes glinting with that same cruel, hungry expression. "You can't escape me," it whispered, its voice soft and slithering. "You are mine, forever." Emma tried to run again, her feet scrambling to find purchase on the cold stone floor, but the doll was faster. It darted forward, its small legs moving with a horrifying swiftness, and before she could reach the door, it was there, standing between her and freedom. "You will play," the doll said again, its voice high-pitched and maddening. Forever. Emma's breath hitched in her throat as she stared at it, her body frozen in terror. The walls around her began to move, the shadows flickering as if the house itself was alive, feeding off her fear. She was no longer in control. She couldn't escape. The ticking had grown louder, faster, like the ticking of an unstoppable clock, marking the time she had left. And then, the doll's voice came again, this time louder, clearer. "Play with me forever." The words burned through Emma's mind, and she realized with a sickening sense of dread that she had no choice. The game had already begun. There was no way out. The doll had claimed her, and she would play with it forever. Emma's mind swirled with confusion, a haze of fear clouding her thoughts. The walls of the cold stone room seemed to close in around her, shrinking with every breath she took. She pressed her back against the stone, trembling, her heart thudding in her chest. The doll's piercing gaze locked onto her, its smile stretched unnaturally wide. The ticking from the clock in her mind never stopped. It ticked and talked, louder and faster, drowning out all other sounds until it was the only thing she could hear, the only thing she could feel. Time was slipping away, and she was no longer in control. The doll's fingers twitched, sending a chill down Emma's spine. It was still standing in the doorway, its presence as unnerving as ever. The tiny, lifeless body of the doll seemed almost too still, too quiet, until, of course, it moved. With a sudden, jerking motion, it took a step forward. Its tiny legs scraped against the stone floor, the sound like nails on a chalkboard. The doll's eyes never left Emma. She gasped, stumbling backward as it advanced, its mechanical joints creaking. "You can't hide from me," it said in that same, eerie whisper, its voice strangely warm, as if it were somehow enjoying this moment. "You will play. You have to." Emma's eyes darted around the room, looking for any way out, but there was nothing. The door behind her had vanished. The stone walls were featureless, without windows or doors, trapping her in a space that felt like an endless void. She was suffocating, drowning in a thick air of terror and hopelessness. "You will play," the doll repeated, its voice colder now, a mocking hiss lacing its words. "You will play forever." "No!" Emma screamed, her voice high-pitched with desperation. She pushed herself up, forcing her legs to move even as they trembled beneath her weight. Her pulse pounded in her ears. "I won't play with you anymore." But the doll was relentless. It reached out, its tiny wooden fingers brushing her arm. The moment it touched her skin, she felt a surge of cold seep into her bones, like a chill that froze her very soul. She gasped in shock, her body stiffening against its icy grip. "You don't get to choose," the doll said softly, almost soothingly. "You were chosen the moment you touched me." Emma recoiled, her mind screaming for escape. She struggled to pull away, but the doll's grip only tightened, its fingers digging into her skin, as if the wood had turned to iron. The force was too strong. She couldn't escape it. "You are mine now," the doll said, its voice now a growl, dripping with malice. "And I am you." Suddenly, Emma felt a sharp pain in her chest, like a cold, invisible hand gripping her heart. The doll had its fingers pressed against her, but she couldn't see them, couldn't see where the pain was coming from. The room started to spin, her head dizzy, as if the very air itself had turned to liquid. The doll stepped closer, its small figure looming over her, its eyes gleaming with an unholy light. "We'll be together forever," it whispered, its voice crawling under Emma's skin, burrowing into her very thoughts. "Forever." "No!" Emma gasped, her breath catching in her throat. I won't let you, you can't." The doll's laugh cut her off. It was a high-pitched, sickening sound, like the caw of a crow in a storm. The world around Emma began to distort. The walls twisted, the stone shifting like a living thing, closing in tighter and tighter until it felt like there was no air left to breathe. She felt herself being pulled downward, her legs giving way beneath her as the ground seemed to fall away. The doll's grip on her wrist was unyielding, and with each passing second, Emma felt herself being drawn deeper into the darkness. It was as if the doll were dragging her into its very core, into the depths of whatever cursed place she had stumbled into. She tried to scream, but her voice was swallowed by the ever-increasing pressure around her, the sensation of being squeezed from all sides. The walls of the room weren't stone anymore. They were soft, like the flesh of some twisted creature, moving, shifting, alive. And then she heard it again. The ticking. It was louder now. So much louder. The noise was deafening, shaking the very ground beneath her feet. The sound seemed to come from everywhere, echoing off the walls, growing faster, as if the passage of time had been distorted beyond comprehension. Each tick was like a lash to her skin, a cruel reminder that her time was running out. "Forever," the doll whispered again, and Emma's vision blurred. The world was breaking apart, crumbling, and she felt herself slipping away. Her body collapsed to the ground, her knees hitting the cold floor with a sickening thud. She could feel the doll's tiny fingers digging into her skin, pulling her closer, dragging her into the dark void. And then, just as suddenly as it had all started, everything stopped. The ticking ceased. The room went quiet. For a moment, Emma dared to open her eyes. She was no longer in the stone room, no longer surrounded by the suffocating presence of the doll. Instead, she was back in her own room. The familiar walls were there, the bed she had slept in, the soft light of the early morning seeping through the curtains. She gasped, unsure of what was real anymore. Had it all been a dream? Was she free? But then she heard it, the soft, mechanical clicking of tiny feet. Her blood ran cold as she slowly turned her head toward the edge of her bed. The doll was there, sitting quietly on the floor, its cold eyes staring up at her, waiting. It hadn't left. It was still there, and now it was watching her once again. The doll's lips twisted into a grin, its smile impossibly wide. "You can never leave me," it whispered, its voice a low rasp, sending chills through her spine. "You'll always play with me. Forever." Emma's breath caught in her throat as the darkness crept back in, and she realized with a sickening certainty that she had never truly escaped. The room around Emma began to distort again, the walls warping and stretching like the fabric of a nightmare. The air grew thick, heavy, as if the very room itself was closing in around her. Her heart hammered in her chest, but it was not just fear that gripped her. It was the suffocating weight of certainty. She knew, without a doubt, that this was no ordinary doll. It was something far worse, something ancient, powerful, and relentless. The doll's grin widened, its glass eyes gleaming with cruel delight as it tilted its head, observing her with an unsettling calmness. Emma tried to move, but her legs wouldn't respond. She felt paralyzed, trapped in her own body. The doll didn't need to touch her anymore. It had already taken her, in every way that mattered. The clicking sound began again, this time slower, more deliberate, like a countdown echoing in her skull. Each tick was like a dagger in her mind, the sound so sharp and insistent that she could almost feel it stabbing into her thoughts, tearing at the edges of her sanity. "You tried to escape," the doll said, its voice a mockery of sweetness. "But there is no escaping me. There is no escape from us." Emma could feel her skin crawling, as though the doll's presence had seeped into every pore of her being. It was no longer just in the room with her. It was within her. "What do you want from me?" Emma whispered, her voice trembling, barely more than a breath. The doll's smile widened even more. "I already have everything I want from you," it purred, its voice dripping with venom. "You are mine now." The words seemed to seep into her, soaking into her mind, her soul, as though they were etched into her very bones. The air grew colder, and Emma could see her breath clouding before her. Her limbs felt numb, her mind too fogged with fear to think clearly. But she knew one thing for certain now. She couldn't outrun the doll. She couldn't outsmart it. It had already won. "You will play with me, Emma," the doll said, and the words sounded like a promise, a cruel, twisted fate she couldn't escape. Forever. She clutched her chest, feeling the weight of the curse settle over her like a blanket of ice. Her heart raced, but the fear now had a strange undercurrent to it, resignation. She had thought she could fight it. She had thought she could resist. But no matter how hard she tried, the doll was always there, its presence like a shadow that would never fade. Her mind flashed back to the first day she had seen the doll, the day it had arrived in her room, beautiful and lifelike. She had thought it was a gift, a simple toy, something to hold and cherish. But now she realized, the moment she had touched it, the moment she had let it into her world, she had sealed her fate. The ticking became louder again, faster, as if the doll was counting down to something, counting down to the final moment. Emma could feel it, the pull of the clockwork gears, grinding and turning beneath her skin, her flesh. She wanted to scream, to run, but all she could do was watch in helpless horror as the doll took another step forward, its eyes never leaving hers. "You will dance with me," the doll whispered. Its tiny hands stretched toward her, its fingers almost tender, like the fingers of a lover, but Emma knew better. She knew what it really wanted. "You will obey." "No!" Emma shouted, her voice breaking. She tried to fight the doll's pull, but the more she struggled, the more she felt herself sinking into it, like quicksand. "You can't resist," the doll said softly, its voice full of dark satisfaction. "You're a part of me now, and I am part of you." Her vision began to blur. She could feel the gears turning inside her own body, clicking and grinding like the doll, like something deep inside her was becoming more and more like it. She didn't want to be part of it. She didn't want to be its anymore. But the more she resisted, the more she could feel herself giving in. It was like a slow erosion, her willpower crumbling bit by bit until there was nothing left but the mechanical rhythm of the doll's voice in her head. "You will play," it repeated, the words like a chant, a spell. "Forever." Emma's breathing became shallow, her body trembling violently. Her pulse raced as she fought against the horrible sensation that was overtaking her. She closed her eyes, wishing for everything to end, wishing for it to all go away. But when she opened them again, the doll was still there, standing right in front of her, watching her with those cold, lifeless eyes. It never blinked. It never moved like a normal thing would. It was more than just a doll. It was alive. I'm not you," Emma said through gritted teeth, her voice hoarse but full of defiance. "I'm not part of you." The doll tilted its head, its smile never faltering. "Oh, Emma," it said, its voice soft and mocking. "You are more like me than you think." And with that, the room seemed to shift once more. The walls stretched further out, the space between her and the doll becoming infinite. The doll's form began to blur, its features distorting like something out of a nightmare, its grin twisting and growing grotesque. Emma closed her eyes, clenching them shut, and she could feel herself falling again, falling into a deep, endless darkness. Time no longer had meaning. The ticking had stopped, the world around her had vanished, and she was left alone with the doll, in a place where no one could save her. There would be no waking up, no return to her old life. She was trapped. She had always been trapped. In the distance, the faintest sound of clicking echoed through the void, and the doll's voice whispered one last time, "Forever." The darkness swallowed Emma whole, its oppressive weight pressing down on her, suffocating her. She couldn't see, couldn't hear anything except the incessant thrum of her own heartbeat, pulsing like a warning, like an alarm that would never stop. Every fiber of her being screamed to wake up, to escape, but it was futile. She was trapped in a place where time had no meaning, where reality was warped, twisted, just like the doll. The clicking had stopped for now, but Emma could still feel it. In her bones, in her mind. It was always there, a faint reminder of the presence that never let go. The doll was always near, its cold eyes watching, its mechanical heart beating in sync with hers. The longer she stayed, the more she could feel the pull, the strange, mechanical hunger that was consuming her. Suddenly, the air shifted, cold and damp, like a breath of wind from an ancient grave. Emma opened her eyes, though she didn't know how long it had been since she closed them. The world before her was still pitch black, but now she felt something different, something moving just beyond her reach, something alive. "You're here," a soft, almost melodic voice whispered in her ear. The words sent a shiver down her spine, like ice water running through her veins. Emma's breath caught in her throat. She wasn't alone. The darkness around her began to ripple, as if it had a life of its own. Shadows stretched across the ground, creeping toward her, swallowing the space between her and the source of the voice. And then slowly the light began to return, not real light, but something different. Something cold, like the dull gleam of moonlight filtered through a thick fog. The doll appeared again, just like before, but now its form was no longer a harmless plaything. Its once smooth features were now cracked and weathered, its joints clicking and whirring like a broken machine, desperately trying to function. It had become something else, something far darker, more sinister. Emma's breath hitched, her legs shaking as she stood, her body moving without her control. The doll's gaze bore into her, those cold glass eyes locked on her, its smile twisted and grotesque. But it was more than just a doll now. It was a creature, a thing that had taken something from her, something that had become part of her soul. "No," Emma whispered, shaking her head, trying to fight the overwhelming sense of dread that had taken root in her chest. "You're not real." But the doll only laughed, a sound that didn't come from its mouth, but from deep within its hollow chest, a rattling, mechanical sound that shook the air itself. It was no longer a toy. It was alive. "You are real, Emma," it whispered back, its voice cold and hollow. "You're just part of me now." The room shifted again, the shadows closing in, the walls growing tighter, squeezing the very air from her lungs. Emma's hands trembled as she reached out, desperately clawing at the walls, trying to find something, anything, to anchor her in this madness. The world around her felt like it was folding in on itself, like the very fabric of reality was being unraveled. The doll tilted its head, watching her with a cruel fascination, its mouth stretching into a grin that seemed to grow impossibly wide. "You're mine now," it said, its voice turning into a rasp, the words grinding like metal against stone. "And I'm yours. Forever." Emma shook her head, tears streaming down her face as she collapsed to her knees. She couldn't fight it anymore. She couldn't escape it. The doll had won, and now it was part of her. Her body trembled as the gears in her mind began to turn in sync with the doll's. She could feel the cold metal shifting beneath her skin, the clockwork mechanism that had started deep within her, something she couldn't control. The doll was inside her now, not just a presence, but a living, breathing part of her soul. And then she heard it, the ticking. It was no longer just a sound. It was her heartbeat. It was the ticking of time. It was hers and the doll's, and every moment, every second, was lost in its rhythm, the endless cycle of time that never stopped, never slowed. It was all-consuming. It was eternal. "No! No, please!" Emma's voice broke as the realization crashed down on her like a tidal wave. "I didn't want this. I never wanted this." But the doll only smiled wider, the edges of its mouth stretching too far, the cracks in its face deepening, as if the very smile had become a grotesque part of its being. The clockwork whirred, grinding like the sound of machinery working at full speed, unstoppable and relentless. "You had no choice," the doll whispered, its voice now an echo inside her head, bouncing off the walls of her thoughts. "You were always meant to be mine, and I'm yours, forever." And then everything went silent. For a moment, Emma felt nothing. No ticking, no doll, no clockwork, just an oppressive, soul-crushing silence. But then, ever so faintly, the sound returned. The ticking, quiet at first, but louder with each passing second, growing faster, as if it were counting down to something. It was time. The doll's words had been a promise, an eternal bond. There was no escape now, no way out. The darkness stretched further, the ticking growing into a deafening crescendo that filled her mind, consumed every thought she had left. Emma closed her eyes, her final tear slipping down her cheek as she felt herself fade away, not into nothingness, but into the endless cycle of time. And in the distance a soft, cold laugh echoed, and the doll's voice whispered one last time, "Forever." The silence that followed the final tick was suffocating. Emma was no longer sure if she was still alive, still breathing, still in her body. The room had faded, the doll had faded, everything had faded, as if it had never existed in the first place. Or maybe it was her mind, slowly eroding, that made it all seem like an illusion. But then, deep within the crushing quiet, she heard it again. A faint metallic click. And it wasn't just any click, it was the unmistakable sound of gears turning, of delicate clockwork winding into motion. Emma's body tensed, her muscles stiffening, as if she were being pulled from deep within her own mind. The sound was unmistakable now, the doll was back. With a sudden jolt, Emma was yanked back into reality. The coldness that had surrounded her receded, and her vision blurred, flickering like a broken light. Her body moved of its own accord, jerking as though strings were being pulled from within her. The doll's presence was undeniable. It had always been there, and now it had found her. Her limbs, no longer in control, stiffened with the clicking rhythm, moving in time with the doll's actions. She could feel the clockwork winding inside her, like a switch being flipped, an unnatural mechanical force. She could no longer resist it. She couldn't even scream, the words lost inside her. The room she now found herself in was unfamiliar, but somehow it felt the same. The same warped reality, the same suffocating sense of doom. But this time it was different, something had changed. The doll stood before her, no longer the doll she once knew. It had transformed, its eyes now glowing with a faint, ominous light. Its mouth no longer smiled, no, it grinned. A grin that seemed to stretch further and further, until its face was little more than a twisted mask of malice. Its body was no longer a simple toy. It was a creature, fully realized, part machine, part living nightmare. "You're awake now," the doll said softly, its voice cold, but with a strange note of satisfaction. "We're awake together." The words didn't make sense, yet they did. Emma's pulse raced, her throat tight as she tried to pull herself free, but the gears inside her body, inside her mind, kept her locked in place. "We," the doll repeated, as if savoring the word. "We are one now, Emma. You and I forever." The reality around her seemed to stretch and distort like a warped photograph, the walls bending and stretching, the room folding in on itself. The ticking grew louder, more frantic. It filled her mind, filled her soul, until it was all she could hear, all she could feel. But no matter how much she fought it, no matter how much she screamed in her mind, there was no escaping it. The doll's grin grew wider still, impossibly wide, until it consumed its entire face, like something made of nightmare and broken clockwork. And then, with a sharp click, Emma's body froze. The ticking stopped, the world stopped, and for a split second, there was nothing, nothing but emptiness. Then, slowly, the doll's eyes flickered, and its mechanical grin softened. "We are eternal now," the doll whispered, its voice like a caress, like the gentle ticking of a clock winding down. The darkness consumed everything. Time seemed to stretch endlessly, like a fog that had no beginning and no end. Emma could feel herself slipping, her sense of self fading as the mechanical rhythm of the doll pulsed through her. The gears in her mind spun faster, pushing everything else aside, thoughts, memories, her very will, until all that was left was the cold, unyielding clockwork. The doll's grip on her tightened, and she could feel the bond between them becoming stronger, more permanent. The world around her began to shift again, like a broken mirror slowly realigning. Emma was no longer sure where she ended and the doll began. It was as if they had become one, the same machinery, the same mind, the same endless ticking. The darkness pressed against her, folding her in on herself, until the room vanished entirely. All that remained was the infinite sound of the gears, ticking and ticking and ticking. In this suffocating void, Emma realized something she had tried so desperately to deny. She had become the doll. There was no escape. She was no longer a person, no longer a child with dreams and fears. She was a machine, bound by the same laws of time, twisted and contorted into a thing that could only follow orders, that could only exist in sync with the relentless tick-tock of the clock. She had become part of the endless cycle, forever. The doll's voice echoed in her mind, whispering words that felt both alien and familiar. "You are mine, Emma. You always were." And Emma, trapped within her own mind, could do nothing but accept it. There was no more fight left in her. The clock had stopped ticking. For a moment, there was silence, an eerie stillness that seemed to last forever. Then, faintly, a sound broke through the quiet. A soft click, like the turning of a key in an old lock, and with it came the gentle whir of gears winding into motion. The doll moved again, but it was not alone, for as the doll stirred, its body shifting in that jerky, mechanical fashion, another presence rose from the shadows. A figure, indistinct at first, became clearer as it emerged into the dim light. It was a person, a child, no older than Emma had been when she first received the doll. The child stood still for a moment, gazing at the doll with an expression of quiet fascination, before the corners of their mouths stretched into a grin. The same grin, the same cold, mechanical smile. As the child bent down to pick up the doll, their movements echoed Emma's, slow, deliberate, and unnervingly precise. The doll's eyes gleamed with that same hollow light, and as it settled into the child's arms, the ticking began once more, loud and clear, as though time had resumed its endless march. And deep within the child's eyes, behind the mask of innocence, there was a flicker of something darker. A flicker of something alive. The cycle had begun again. The clockwork had claimed another. Name of the next story: The Blackwater Ritual. A cold mist hung over Blackwater Lake as the sun dipped below the horizon. It was the kind of mist that made you shiver even if you weren't cold, the kind that settled into your bones and made you feel like something was watching you. The water, usually calm and peaceful, now seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, as though it were alive, breathing in the dark. The group of friends sat huddled around a small campfire near the lake's edge, their faces illuminated by the flickering orange light. There was Mark, the daring one, always pushing the boundaries, Sarah, the quiet skeptic who usually didn't buy into things, James, who was fascinated by the occult and all things supernatural, and Emily, who, although terrified, would never admit it. They had all heard the stories about Blackwater Lake, the whispers about its dark past, the strange disappearances, the eerie feeling that gripped anyone who dared to spend the night. Mark, always the instigator, had come up with the idea to perform the ritual. "It's just a legend, right?" Mark said, his voice teasing, as he held up a worn leather-bound book that he had found in the dusty corner of an old bookstore. "What's the worst that can happen? It's just some ritual. We'll be fine. Trust me." Sarah rolled her eyes. "You can't be serious, Mark. This is ridiculous. Rituals are for horror movies, not real life." James leaned forward, intrigued by the book's old, yellowed pages. "I don't know, Sarah. I've read about this ritual before. It's interesting. It could be dangerous, sure, but it might give us the answers we're looking for." Emily hugged her knees to her chest, staring at the water. "I don't like this," she murmured, her voice barely audible over the crackling of the fire. "I have a bad feeling." Mark grinned and waved a hand dismissively. "Come on, Emily, it'll be fun. We'll do it, get a bit of a thrill, and then head home. Nothing bad will happen." Despite her hesitation, Emily couldn't help but feel the pull of curiosity. She knew they were all in it together, and if they did this, they'd do it as a group. She glanced at Sarah, who was shaking her head but didn't speak, then at James, who was nodding eagerly. Mark stood up, looking at the lake. "It's simple. We need to make a circle, light the candles, and recite the incantation." "That's it." The lake seemed to respond to his words. The the water lapping at the shore a little more restlessly, as if it had heard them and was waiting. They set up the ritual site on the ground, the book opened to the specific ritual, its pages filled with cryptic symbols and words in an ancient language. The words were long and twisted, like something from a dream or a nightmare. As they followed Mark's instructions, the air around them grew heavier, colder, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should have. James lit the candles and placed them around the circle. We need to say the words in unison. The book says the power is in the togetherness and the bond. Mark stepped into the center of the circle, holding the book high, a strange excitement in his eyes. "Okay, here we go," he said, his voice almost trembling with anticipation. "On 3. 1, he said, his voice growing more serious. 2, James added, glancing nervously at the water's surface, which seemed darker now, as if the lake was absorbing the light. 3. Together, they recited the words from the book, the ancient language flowing from their mouths, strange and unearthly. As they spoke, the wind picked up, stirring the leaves and causing the flames of the candles to flicker wildly. A faint hum, low and almost imperceptible, filled the air. For a brief moment, everything seemed still, the wind quieting, the water growing calm. Then, without warning, a large wave crashed against the shore, splashing over the edges of the ritual circle. "What the hell?" Sarah gasped, stepping back, but her feet were already sinking into the damp ground, the wet earth clinging to her shoes. "Something's wrong," Emily said, her voice shaky as she grabbed Mark's arm. "We should have stopped." "We shouldn't have." Before she could finish her sentence, a sudden, bone-chilling gust of wind swept through the camp, extinguishing the candles with a violent burst of air. The mist thickened, curling in around them, hiding the lake from view. James was the first to speak, his voice barely audible over the eerie howling of the wind. It's not supposed to be like this, right? This wasn't in the book." Mark's face had gone pale. "It wasn't supposed to be like this. We're too late." The water in front of them began to stir, the surface rippling as though something beneath was moving, something large, something ancient. "I told you," Emily whispered, her eyes wide with terror. "I told you this was a mistake." Suddenly, a deep, guttural sound emerged from the depths of Blackwater Lake, so low it seemed to vibrate the ground beneath them. It was as though the lake itself was awakening, stretching out of centuries of slumber. The surface of the water churned violently, and in the distance, strange shapes began to emerge from the murk, shadows moving beneath the surface, shifting like something vast and ancient. "What is that?" Sarah cried, backing away as she looked at the water in horror. The shapes grew larger, and then, with a terrible sound like the cracking of stone, something broke the surface of the lake. It was a hand, no, a claw made of black, rotting flesh, thick and covered in scales, long and twisted, reaching up toward the sky. Emily gasped, stumbling back in terror. "What did we do? What did we wake up?" Mark didn't answer. His face was ashen, his eyes locked on the monstrous thing that now loomed above the water. It was massive, like a serpent with long, gnarled limbs, its eyes glowing a sickly green, its mouth gaping wide, full of jagged teeth that seemed to grow sharper by the second. Sarah screamed, turning to run, but the ground beneath her feet seemed to shift and buckle, as though the earth itself were alive and moving to prevent her escape. The water began to rise, pushing toward them, and the claw reached down, its fingers curling toward the shore. "We need to leave now," James shouted, but his voice was lost in the chaos as the creature let out an ear-splitting roar. The ground shook, the mist grew heavier, and the water continued to churn violently. The friends found themselves caught in a nightmare, trapped between the lake and the creature emerging from it. Mark was frozen in place, too terrified to move. "We're too late," he whispered. "We've opened it. We've awoken it." Emily's heart raced as she grabbed Mark by the arm, pulling him toward the trees. "We need to get out of here. We need to run." But as she turned, the clawed hand swept down, its massive fingers curling around the ground, and everything went dark. The darkness was suffocating, the air thick with the smell of wet earth and rotting wood. Emily's pulse thundered in her ears as she pulled Mark behind her legs trembling beneath her. The ground felt unstable, shifting with every step, as though it were alive, responding to the monstrous presence that had risen from the lake. "Mark, we have to move," she gasped, dragging him through the thickening mist, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. Mark didn't respond. He was staring back at the lake, his face pale, his eyes wide with terror. It's coming," he whispered, almost in disbelief. "We're not going to make it." Emily glanced back, her heart dropping into her stomach. The clawed hand had retreated beneath the surface, but the water was still churning, its movements more erratic and violent than ever. The mist was so thick now that it was impossible to see the lake clearly, but the faint outline of something massive shifted beneath the surface, something with glowing eyes, something that had no business existing. "We can't outrun it," Sarah cried, her voice breaking. She had appeared out of the mist, breathless, her eyes wide with fear. "It's everywhere." James staggered out of the fog, his face contorted with panic. "We need to get to the car. We need to leave before it." A shriek, deafening and unnatural, split the air. It was like nothing human, a sound so primal and guttural that it sent a wave of cold terror through every one of them. Emily spun around, her heart nearly stopping as the creature emerged from the lake once again, this time much closer. Its massive, scaly body towered over them, and its enormous head loomed above, its glowing eyes fixed on the group. The creature's mouth opened, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth, and then, almost impossibly, a voice boomed from deep within its chest. "You woke me." The sound reverberated through their bones, as though the very air around them was vibrating with its power. Emily's legs felt weak, like they might collapse beneath her, but she couldn't tear her gaze away. The creature's presence was overwhelming, suffocating, and the whispers that filled her mind made her feel like she was being drawn into its very essence. Mark's voice was barely a whisper, his tone filled with regret. We shouldn't have done this. It's too powerful. We can't stop it." The creature's massive form shifted, its long limbs pulling the water closer to the shore, the mist swirling around it in an almost hypnotic pattern. As it moved, it seemed to distort the world itself, the trees bent under its presence, their branches twisting and cracking. The ground trembled beneath their feet, as if the earth was being reshaped by the creature's will. It began to speak again, its voice cold and ancient. "I have slept for centuries, but now you have awoken me. You have broken the seal that kept me bound beneath the water. You will suffer for your ignorance." Emily could feel her heart pounding in her throat as the creature's eyes locked onto hers, its gaze unnervingly intelligent. She tried to back away, but her feet were stuck in the earth, as though the ground itself were holding her in place. "Run!" James shouted, his voice breaking. "Get to the car. It's the only chance we have." Sarah didn't need to be told twice. She turned and sprinted, pushing through the fog, her footsteps barely audible over the creature's growls. Emily followed, grabbing Mark's arm again, pulling him along, but he resisted, his body trembling with fear. "We can't outrun it," Mark said, his voice hollow. "It's too powerful. There's nowhere to hide." The creature's laugh was low and mocking. It was the sound of something ancient, something that had seen civilizations rise and fall. "You cannot escape. The water is mine, and so is the land. You will not leave here alive." Suddenly, the ground beneath them cracked open, and from the fissures, thick black tendrils shot up like serpents, wrapping around their legs, pulling them down. The water surged forward, and Emily screamed as she felt herself being dragged toward the lake. The tendrils tightened, and the mist grew denser, swirling violently, until she could hardly see anything. "Help!" she cried, struggling against the force that held her, but the more she fought, the stronger the pull became. Mark was next to her, his face twisted in terror. But before he could finish, one of the tendrils wrapped around his throat, lifting him off the ground. His hands grasped at the air, his eyes wide with fear, but there was no escape. The creature's voice rang out again, louder this time, as if it were savoring every moment of their fear. "Struggle all you want," it said. "It will do you no good." Emily fought against the tendrils, her breath ragged, but the more she struggled, the tighter they became. The lake seemed to stretch endlessly, the creature's form rising higher, blotting out the sky. The very air around them felt heavy, charged with a force they could not understand. Then, just as it seemed like she might be pulled under, the ground beneath her feet shifted again. The mist parted for a brief moment, and through the fog, Emily caught sight of something, a figure moving through the trees. It was Sarah. "Emily!" Sarah screamed, her voice cutting through the fog. "Emily, this way! Run! I found a way!" But it was too late. The tendrils tightened one last time, and everything went black. When Emily regained consciousness, it was in the suffocating silence of the forest, the heavy, unnatural stillness pressing against her chest. Her mind swam with confusion, but her body instinctively jerked to life, every muscle straining as she struggled to move. Her legs felt numb, and her arms were heavy, as though she had been held in place for far too long. The ground beneath her was cold and wet, the earth slick with something dark and viscous that she couldn't quite identify. She pushed herself up, her hands trembling as she wiped the dampness from her face. Her surroundings were eerily quiet. The air was thick with fog, so dense that it seemed like a physical presence, smothering everything in its path. The trees loomed around her like silent, watching sentinels, their branches swaying gently in the wind that had suddenly picked up. "Mark?" Emily's voice cracked as she called out, but there was no answer. She tried to stand, but her legs buckled beneath her, and she collapsed back to the ground. Panic clawed at her chest. "Mark!" she shouted again, this time more desperately. There was no response, only the distant, unsettling sound of water moving, lapping at something, like the waves of the lake were creeping closer. Emily's eyes darted around, scanning the foggy horizon for any sign of movement. The mist seemed to pulse around her, and for a moment, she thought she saw something moving within it, a shadow, a silhouette. "Sarah," she called out weakly, though the sound of her own voice felt hollow, swallowed by the fog. She stumbled forward, her feet dragging, her pulse racing. The woods were unfamiliar. She didn't recognize the path she was on. Was she even still near the lake? Was she still alive, or had something much worse taken her? The fog pressed in tighter, making it harder to breathe, to see. Then, from the shadows, a figure emerged. It was a tall shape, indistinct at first, but as it stepped into the faint light, Emily's heart nearly stopped. It was Mark. His face was pale, his eyes wide, almost lifeless, like he was trapped in some kind of trance. His clothes were soaked through, clinging to his body, his skin unnaturally cold and clammy. He stood motionless, staring ahead without acknowledging her presence. "Mark!" Emily cried, scrambling toward him, but he didn't react. She reached out to touch him, but the moment her hand made contact, she felt a coldness so intense it numbed her fingers. "Mark, please say something." But he remained silent, his eyes still locked on something distant, somewhere beyond her reach. Emily's heart sank as she realized that whatever had happened to him, whatever they had awoken from the lake, had claimed him too. "Mark, come on. We have to go," she said, her voice shaking as she tried to pull him toward her. But he didn't move. There was nothing behind those eyes anymore. He was gone. The ground beneath her feet shifted again, and Emily stumbled backward, her pulse hammering in her throat. The air around her thickened, and the distant sound of water lapping grew louder, more insistent. She knew it wasn't just the lake anymore. The thing in the water, the ancient creature they had woken, was moving again, and it wasn't just after them. It was after everything. Suddenly, the earth rumbled, and a low growl echoed from deep within the woods, shaking the trees. It was like a warning. a growl of something far more terrifying than any animal, something far older and hungrier. The air grew colder still, the fog now so thick that Emily could barely see Mark standing in front of her. Then, without warning, the mist parted, and before her stood Sarah, her face as pale as death, her eyes wide with horror. She was gasping for air, her breath shallow, like she had been running for a long time. "Emily," she cried, her voice ragged. You're alive?" Emily could barely process the relief that flooded her chest, but the relief was short-lived. Sarah's eyes darted nervously over Emily's shoulder, her lips trembling as she whispered, "It's here. It's coming." Emily spun around, her heart dropping into her stomach as the ground shook violently beneath them. From the fog, the creature emerged again, its massive body now fully revealed. It was the same monstrous form, but now it was more terrifying than ever. Its eyes burned with an otherworldly light, and its jagged, gaping mouth opened, revealing rows of teeth that seemed to stretch impossibly wide. "You cannot escape," the creature boomed, its voice a crushing force that rattled their bones. "The water is my domain. The land is my kingdom. You are nothing but trespassers." The creature's tendrils reached out from the lake, snaking through the air like serpents, their movements swift and deliberate. Emily felt her heart slam against her ribs as she backed away, but there was nowhere to go. The fog was closing in on them again, thick and suffocating. Sarah was shaking, her body rigid with fear. We have to do something. We have to finish what we started." Emily's stomach churned. What do you mean? Are you insane? We should have never done this in the first place." But Sarah's eyes were fixed on the creature, and her voice was filled with a strange, eerie calm. "There's a way to make it stop, a way to undo it all." Before Emily could respond, Sarah turned and started walking toward the lake, her movements slow but purposeful, like she was under some kind of spell. Emily rushed forward, grabbing her arm. "Sarah, no! We have to get out of here." But Sarah jerked away, her eyes wide with a strange, unblinking intensity. "I can't go back. This is the only way." "Please," Emily begged, her voice breaking. "Please, we don't have to do this. We'll find another way." Sarah turned to face her, her expression hard and unyielding. "It's too late for that." And then, with a final glance at Emily, Sarah stepped into the lake. Her body moved with eerie precision, like she was being pulled by an invisible force, drawn deeper into the water. Emily screamed, trying to pull her back, but it was no use. The lake seemed to swallow Sarah whole, her body sinking into the darkness. The creature let out a deafening roar, and the tendrils lashed out, wrapping around Emily's legs, pulling her toward the lake. Her scream echoed into the fog, but she couldn't escape. The creature's presence was overwhelming, suffocating, and she felt her body being dragged toward the water. And then, everything went black. When Emily opened her eyes again, she was no longer in the forest. The world around her was dark, too dark. The kind of dark that seemed to swallow sound, light, and hope. She felt weightless, as though she were floating in the void, her body suspended in the inky blackness. For a long, agonizing moment, she couldn't breathe, couldn't move, couldn't even think. The cold was so deep it felt as though it had seeped into her bones, freezing her from the inside out. Her lungs ached for air, but it wasn't the kind of air you could breathe. It was the air of the deep lake, thick and choking, and it felt like it was pressing against her chest from all sides. She tried to scream, but the water filled her mouth, her throat, cutting off her voice, suffocating her. But then the pressure lifted. With a violent gasp, Emily jolted awake, her body suddenly crashing back to the ground with a thud. Her head spun, her vision blurred, and for a moment she didn't know where she was. She looked around, trying to make sense of her surroundings. The fog still clung to the trees, but she could see the water now, stretching out before her. The dark, still lake. It seemed different somehow, darker, as though the water itself held some kind of ancient, malignant presence. Emily's pulse raced. The lake, the ritual. Sarah, Mark. The events played out in fragments in her mind, disjointed and hazy, like a nightmare she couldn't escape. She looked around for any sign of her friends, but there was nothing. No trace of them. No sound except for the faint ripple of water against the shore. She tried to stand, but her legs were weak, trembling beneath her, her head pounding with each breath. Every movement felt wrong, as though the very air itself was heavier here, more oppressive. She took a step forward, then another, her eyes scanning the shoreline. Then she heard it, a low guttural sound. It was coming from the lake. Something was stirring beneath the surface, something massive, something ancient. Emily froze. Her breath caught in her throat as the sound grew louder, closer. The water shifted, rippling violently, as if something beneath it was moving. She took another step back, her heart pounding in her chest. The creature, the thing from the water, it was still here, still watching, still waiting. A shadow began to rise from the depths. It was enormous, a black, monstrous shape, breaking the surface of the water like some kind of ancient beast awakening after centuries of slumber. Emily could see the glistening, wet texture of its skin, like the surface of the lake itself had come to life. Its eyes burned with an unholy light, yellow and endless, staring directly at her. The growl echoed once again, louder this time, rattling the trees and the very ground beneath her feet. The tendrils rose from the water like serpents, twisting and thrashing, their movements so fast that Emily barely had time to react. One of them struck out, its slimy surface brushing against her leg, sending a wave of nausea through her. She stumbled back, falling to the ground, but the tendrils were already moving toward her, their reach long and swift. "Please," she gasped, her voice barely a whisper. "Please no more." The creature's growl deepened, vibrating through the ground beneath her. It was as if the earth itself were alive, pulsing in rhythm with the creature's movements. She scrambled backward, her heart racing, but the tendrils were closing in, their cold, slick surfaces wrapping around her limbs, pulling her toward the water. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The water's surface rippled, and then, emerging from the depths, a figure appeared. A silhouette in the darkness. It was Sarah. Her body was pale and bloated, her eyes wide open but lifeless. She was floating just above the water, suspended by the tendrils, her mouth open in a silent scream. But there was no sound, only the slow, dreadful pull of the lake. "Sarah!" Emily cried, her voice cracking. "No, please." But Sarah didn't respond. She couldn't. She was already gone, lost to whatever had risen from the depths of the black water. The creature's growl grew louder, the tendrils tightening around Emily's arms, dragging her toward the lake with unrelenting force. She struggled, her fingers slipping against the slick surface of the tendrils, but it was useless. The lake was too strong. The thing beneath the water was too strong. Then, as she was about to be pulled into the dark, cold water, a voice she knew too well, pierced through the fog. "Emily!" It was Mark. His voice was hoarse, broken, but it was unmistakable. Emily turned, her heart leaping in her chest. She could barely see him through the mist, but she could hear his voice growing closer. "Emily, grab my hand. Please." She didn't think. She didn't hesitate. She reached out, her fingers desperately grasping for him. Her heart raced as she felt her hand close around his. For a moment, she thought she had escaped, thought she had a chance. But then she felt it, something sharp and cold, something wet, a tendril, thicker and longer than the others, wrapped around her waist, pulling her away from Mark with terrifying strength. She screamed, her fingers slipping from his grip as the water began to swallow her whole. The last thing she saw before the darkness claimed her was Mark's outstretched hand, his face twisted in anguish, fading into the mist. Then there was nothing. Emily's body felt weightless, as though it was floating somewhere between worlds. She couldn't feel the solid ground beneath her feet, couldn't taste the air in her lungs, couldn't even open her eyes. But she could sense it, the cold, suffocating presence of the lake. She felt as if she were submerged in something deeper than water, something more ancient and terrifying. A force that pressed against her mind, clouding her thoughts, drowning her will to resist. The water, or whatever it was that surrounded her, seemed to pulse with life, its energy vibrating through her skin, her bones, her very soul. Every movement she made, every breath she tried to take, felt as though the darkness around her was tightening its grip, drawing her deeper into its heart. Then she heard the voice again. Not a voice in her head, but a voice that echoed in the distance. It wasn't Mark, it wasn't Sarah, but something far darker. It was the same growl that had rattled the trees, the same sound that had chilled her to the bone, but now it was different. It was closer, more intimate, almost as if it was speaking directly to her. "Emily?" The voice was soft, almost coaxing, like a lover's whisper, but there was nothing gentle about it. It was laced with an undeniable threat, a promise of something far worse than death. She struggled, desperate to break free, but the tendrils had wrapped themselves around her in a vice-like grip. They pulled her deeper, dragging her toward the abyss. The water, or whatever it was that had claimed her, seemed to stretch and twist, an endless expanse of dark, liquid terror. "Let me go!" she screamed, her voice muffled by the weight of the water. But the voice, that same terrible voice, only chuckled in response, sending a shiver down her spine. "Too late," it hissed. Her heart pounded in her chest as the tendrils wrapped tighter, squeezing the air from her lungs. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't even feel the fear anymore. It was as if the lake itself was consuming her, erasing her existence one piece at a time. She could no longer hold on to who she was, no longer remember what it was like to feel the warmth of the sun, the weight of the earth beneath her feet. Then, just as she thought she would lose herself entirely, the pressure released. Emily gasped, her body jerking as if she had been thrown back into the world of the living. Her chest heaved, her lungs desperate for air, but the air she inhaled was thick, heavy, and cold. It burned in her throat, making her choke. For a moment, there was nothing but the sharpness of her breathing, the muffled sound of her heartbeat, the cold, the wet. Then she opened her eyes. She was standing on solid ground again, her legs trembling beneath her. But the world around her had changed. The fog was thicker now, swirling like a living thing, wrapping around her in oppressive tendrils. The lake stretched before her, dark and silent. Its surface was still, as though nothing had disturbed it, nothing except her. But she wasn't alone. There, standing at the water's edge, was a figure. A tall figure, dark and imposing, its face hidden in shadow. Emily's blood ran cold. She recognized it. It was Mark. But something was wrong. He was standing unnaturally still, his body rigid, his eyes wide and vacant, staring at nothing. "Mark?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling. She took a step toward him, but he didn't respond. He just stood there, unmoving, as if he were waiting. A chill ran down her spine as she looked closer. His skin was pale, almost sickly, and his hair hung in tangled strands around his face. His clothes were wet, sticking to his body as though he had been submerged in the water for far too long. But it wasn't just his appearance that frightened her. It was the emptiness in his eyes, the hollow stare that seemed to look through her, not at her. "Mark," she said again, louder this time, her heart pounding in her chest. Still, he didn't move. The sound of the water rippling behind her caught her attention. Slowly, reluctantly, she turned to face the lake. And that's when she saw it. Rising from the water, like a nightmare made flesh, was the creature. It towered over her, its body a mass of black, glistening scales that shimmered in the dim light. Its eyes were those same glowing yellow orbs, burning with an ancient fury. It was massive, far larger than she had ever imagined, its tendrils writhing like snakes, reaching for her. She wanted to scream, to run, to escape, but her body refused to move. Her legs were frozen in place, her feet stuck to the earth like they were cemented there. And then the creature spoke. Its voice was deep, like the rumble of thunder, but it had the same eerie, seductive quality to it that had come before. "You think you can escape?" it asked, its voice dripping with malice. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to answer, wanted to deny it, but no words came. She could feel the creature's power, its presence suffocating her, drowning her in a sea of hopelessness. The creature stepped closer, the ground shaking beneath its massive form. With each step it took, the earth seemed to groan, as though it were alive, as though it, too, were part of the creature's ancient power. Emily's knees buckled beneath her, and she fell to the ground, her hands pressing into the cold earth as she tried to push herself back. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Please, no more." But the creature didn't answer. Instead, it reached down with one of its enormous tendrils, wrapping it around her waist with a cruel, suffocating grip. She gasped as the pressure increased, crushing the air from her lungs, dragging her toward the water. Her body was limp in the tendril's grasp, her vision beginning to blur. "Let me go," she cried out weakly, but it was useless. Her voice was swallowed by the darkness. As she was pulled toward the lake, Emily felt something break inside her, something that she couldn't name, but she knew it was the last thread of her resistance. She was slipping away, and with that slip, she realized that this was her end. She wasn't meant to survive. She was part of the ritual now, part of the sacrifice. The lake was calling her. It always had, and as she was pulled beneath the surface, her last thought was of the curse that had claimed them all, Mark, Sarah, and now her. The black water had always waited for its next victim, and now it had claimed her. But there was no escape. As Emily was dragged beneath the water, everything around her turned to a suffocating blackness. The lake's icy grip closed in, pulling her deeper and deeper, until the surface above her vanished completely. She couldn't breathe. The tendril around her waist tightened, crushing the air from her lungs, and the world faded to nothingness. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, in the depths of the water, a sound echoed. The low growl of the creature, a vibration that seemed to come from the very bones of the earth, reverberated through the water around her. She could feel it in her chest, her body trembling as the pressure increased. But something else joined it, voices. Faint whispers rising from the deep. Low, mournful sounds, like a chorus of souls trapped in this place for eternity. They didn't speak words. They only moaned, sobbed, and whispered in a language too ancient for her to understand. A language that chilled her soul. She felt her body being pulled, her limbs stiff and unfeeling as she was dragged into the very heart of the lake, into the place where the creature had risen from. The tendrils that had held her were now tightening, squeezing her to the point where she could feel the bones in her body beginning to crack. And then, as the darkness closed in completely, the creature's voice came again, low and unforgiving. "Now you are mine." But Emily's thoughts were already slipping away. The air in her lungs had long since run out. She could feel her consciousness fading, her body succumbing to the cold, to the darkness. And just as her vision blurred, just as the last sliver of life drained from her, she heard one last thing, a scream. It wasn't hers. It was Mark's. Back on the shore, the water seemed calm again. The fog that had once filled the air was dissipating, leaving nothing but an eerie stillness in its wake. But something had changed. The lake was no longer the same. The water rippled softly, almost as if it were alive, as if something beneath the surface was watching, waiting. The creature, its hunger now satisfied, submerged itself back into the depths, disappearing from sight, leaving nothing behind but the cold, silent water. The whispers from the deep ceased. But as the night passed, the ripple of the ritual remained. The Blackwater ritual had been completed. Somewhere, deep beneath the surface, in the heart of the lake, something ancient and vengeful stirred once more, ready to wait for the next group of foolish souls to stumble upon its shores. And in the darkness, there would always be those who would listen to its call. Name of the next story: the forgotten plague. The dust in the old library was thick, clinging to everything. Rows of forgotten books lined the shelves, their spines cracked and yellowed with age. The air smelled stale, as if the building had not been disturbed for decades. But for Samuel Brooks, the historian who had spent his life unearthing the past, this place was a treasure trove. It was quiet here, except for the occasional creak of the wooden floors beneath his feet and the soft rustle of papers in the cold drafts that found their way through cracks in the walls. Samuel had come here looking for something specific, an old town's forgotten history. A small, unmarked town that had been wiped off the map in the early 1800s. No records, no mention in any government documentation. It was as if the town had never existed. Samuel had always found that curious. So he had spent weeks digging through old census records, newspapers, and municipal records in search of any clue as to why the town had vanished. His efforts had finally brought him here, to this isolated library in the middle of nowhere. As he shuffled through the brittle papers, one particular journal caught his attention. Its cover was plain, almost faded beyond recognition, but the smell of age emanated from it, a scent of time trapped within the leather. The name written on the cover was faint, but Samuel could just make it out. Dr. Isaac Harper. Flipping it open, Samuel found detailed entries, some almost illegible. Dr. Isaac Harper had been a physician in the town, or what was left of it, in the year 1823. His notes were filled with descriptions of symptoms, pale skin, high fever, and a strange rash that spread quickly. But it wasn't the illness that caught Samuel's attention, it was the way Harper described it. The disease spread rapidly, killing nearly everyone in the town. Yet, the townspeople didn't seem to be affected equally. Young children, especially, seemed to fare worse. They died almost instantly, their bodies bloated and unrecognizable. What struck Samuel most were the final entries. The handwriting had become erratic, frantic. Dr. Harper wrote about how he himself had started to feel the symptoms of the plague, the same disease that had taken so many others. But there was something more. He mentioned that he had found something in the town's burial grounds, a ritual, something that had been buried for centuries. Samuel's heart began to race as he read the words. The curse has awoken. It's spreading. It's coming for me. The last page of the journal was covered in blood. Not the kind that could be easily mistaken for ink, but fresh, dark red. Samuel stared at it for a long time, his mind reeling from the implications. The town had vanished, and no one had ever spoken of it again. Had the disease really been a plague? Or was there something more? Something darker? He stood up from the desk, the journal still clutched in his hands, his pulse quickening. The room felt colder now, the air heavier. A sense of dread seemed to settle over him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. But he couldn't stop now. Not when he was so close. He had to know more. Samuel began his search again, digging through records that seemed to all lead to the same conclusion. The town was gone, erased from history as if it had never existed. The disease had killed everyone in a matter of days, and yet there were no surviving records of the aftermath. No witnesses, no reports. The town had simply disappeared. A sudden chill ran down his spine, and Samuel turned to look behind him. The sound of creaking floorboards echoed in the silence. No one was there. Just the old library, the old books. He shook his head, trying to shake off the unease that was settling deeper into his bones. But there was something in the back of his mind now, a thought that wouldn't let go. Something about the plague, something about the disease, felt wrong, almost unnatural. Later that evening, Samuel sat at his desk in the small room he had rented above the library, the journal open in front of him. The words still haunted him, even as he stared at the final entry. The curse is spreading. It won't stop, not until it claims everyone. He rubbed his eyes, feeling the exhaustion pulling at him. But as his hand moved away from his face, he felt something cold on his skin. He froze. His fingers brushed against the skin of his neck. He had thought it was the draft, but now there was no mistaking it. A rash, a small raised spot on his skin. Red, angry, as if something beneath the surface was working its way to the surface of his skin. He touched it cautiously, but the burning sensation only increased. His heart pounded as he stood up, rushing to the mirror. His face was pale, too pale. His skin, already flushed with fever, now seemed to have a strange, blotchy appearance, as if the illness was making its way through his body. The rash spread slowly, like ink spilling across paper. "No, this can't be happening," Samuel whispered to himself. But deep down, he knew it was. It was the plague, the forgotten plague. He had been studying it for days, reading about its symptoms, and now they were appearing on his own body. He stumbled backward, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He had to leave, had to get out of here before it was too late. But his legs felt weak, his vision blurry. The room spun around him, and he collapsed onto the floor, his body shaking uncontrollably. The last thing he heard was the sound of the door opening, the soft click of footsteps approaching him from the darkness. The next morning, Samuel awoke in his bed, drenched in sweat. His body ached all over, every muscle sore, as if he had been fighting some unseen force. He rubbed his eyes, trying to push away the grogginess that clung to him, but when he opened them, the world seemed different. The light outside the window was dim, filtered through a strange, greenish hue. The shadows in the room stretched unnaturally long, and the silence was deafening. Samuel sat up, his hands trembling. The rash had spread overnight, creeping up his arms and across his chest. It burned now, hotter than before. Panic began to claw at his chest. He had to find out more. Had to find out what had happened to that town, what had caused this illness. If it was a disease, it was unlike any he had ever read about. But if it was a curse, then he needed to know how to stop it before it claimed him too. Grabbing his coat, Samuel stumbled back to the library. His body felt heavier now, each step a struggle. He could feel his pulse in his ears, his heart racing with fear. What had happened to the townspeople? Had they suffered the same fate he was now experiencing? Inside the library, the air was thick, colder than it had been before. Samuel could feel it in his chest as he breathed. Something was wrong here. The books around him seemed to whisper, as if the very walls held secrets that had been waiting for someone to uncover them. His eyes landed on the map again, the one he had seen earlier. The forgotten town, the place where it all began. Samuel leaned over the desk, staring at the faded map, as a terrible thought struck him. What if the plague wasn't just something that happened to people? What if it had been summoned? What if they had disturbed something that should have been left alone? Something ancient, lying dormant beneath the earth, waiting for the right moment to wake up? His thoughts were interrupted by a sharp pain in his chest. He gasped for air, clutching at his heart. The burning sensation spread, creeping up his throat like fire. His skin was hot now, feverish. His vision blurred again, and he stumbled backward, knocking over a stack of books. But as he reached out for support, his hand landed on something else, something cold, something that hadn't been there before. It was a letter, tucked beneath the books. Samuel's hands shook as he opened it, his breath catching in his throat. The letter was dated 1823, the year the plague had begun. The letter was from Dr. Isaac Harper. It read, "The curse cannot be undone. It will spread until it finds a new vessel. It will not stop." Samuel's breath caught in his throat. The last piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. He wasn't just infected with a plague. He was becoming a part of it. Samuel's eyes widened as he read those chilling words again, his mind struggling to comprehend what was happening to him. The letter trembled in his hands, as if it, too, felt the weight of the words it carried. "It will not stop," he read aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. His throat felt raw, constricted, as if something unseen was tightening around it, choking the life out of him slowly, mercilessly. He looked around the library, his mind whirling with 1,000 questions. What did Dr. Isaac Harper mean by vessel? Was Samuel becoming part of the plague itself? The rash that had spread across his body now burned with an intensity that made his skin feel as though it were on fire. Every movement he made sent waves of pain through him, a deep, gnawing ache that sank into his bones. Samuel stumbled over to the desk, trying to steady himself against it. His hand brushed against the stack of papers, knocking them over. A stray piece of parchment fluttered to the floor, landing in front of him. He bent down to pick it up, his hands shaking so violently that he almost dropped it again. The parchment, yellowed with age, was covered in symbols he didn't recognize, strange, ancient characters, looping and intertwining, as if they had a life of their own. At the top, there was a title scrawled in what looked like a hurried hand, The Ritual of Return. A cold shiver ran down Samuel's spine. He ran his fingers along the symbols, the parchment crinkling under his touch. The Ritual of Return. The name alone sounded like a forbidden practice, something dark and unnatural. As he began to decipher the symbols, a sense of dread crawled up his spine. It spoke of bringing something back, reviving what had been buried long ago. The ritual, as described, wasn't about healing. It was about resurrection. Resurrecting what? Samuel murmured to himself, his voice barely audible over the rising noise in his head. He couldn't grasp the full meaning of the symbols, but the pictures accompanying them made his stomach turn. They were images of the dead, rising from the ground, their faces contorted in agony as they crawled toward something, toward a figure in the shadows, a figure whose outline seemed disturbingly familiar. The images blurred in Samuel's mind as the pain in his chest intensified, and he suddenly collapsed to his knees. He gasped for air, the room spinning violently. His head felt like it was filled with static, his thoughts jumbled and distant. He had to focus. He had to finish this, whatever this was, before it was too late. The words in the letter haunted him, replaying in his mind. It will spread until it finds a new vessel. The plague, whatever it was, had been awakened, and Samuel was its new host. He reached for his coat, a desperate, instinctual need to escape this place, but as his fingers brushed against the fabric, a voice, soft, whispering, echoed in his ear. "Stay." The word was so quiet, so faint, that for a moment, Samuel thought it was his mind playing tricks on him. But then the voice came again, clearer this time. "Stay and understand." Samuel's heart skipped a beat. He spun around, eyes darting across the empty room. No one was there. No one could have spoken. But the voice, the words, they were unmistakable. They felt real as the cold air pressing down on him, as real as the dark, creeping sensation that was gnawing at his insides. He couldn't escape it. Not anymore. His hands clenched the letter in his grip as he forced himself to his feet, his legs trembling beneath him. He staggered back to the map, his vision swimming in and out of focus. The greenish hue in the room had deepened, and the shadows seemed to stretch further, as if reaching out toward him. He didn't know how much longer he could last. His breath came in ragged gasps, his skin burning, the rash spreading up his neck now, pulsing with an unholy rhythm. The ritual of return, was meant to bring something back. But what? What had the townspeople summoned all those years ago? What had been buried under the earth, forgotten by time? His mind raced, trying to put the pieces together, but it felt like he was sinking deeper into a nightmare, the truth slipping through his fingers like sand. He had to find out. He had to know. His hands trembling, Samuel grabbed the nearby lantern, its flickering flame casting eerie shadows across the room. He moved to the door, forcing himself to take one step after another, each movement a struggle, the pain in his chest only intensifying. His body felt like it was betraying him, his own skin turning against him. The outside world greeted him with an oppressive silence. The air was thick and heavy, the fog rolling in from the woods like a living thing, wrapping itself around the town. Samuel could barely see past the end of the street, the fog swallowing up the landscape. He didn't know how long he had been standing there, but everything felt wrong. His gaze drifted toward the distant hill, where the old graveyard lay hidden beneath the trees. A strange compulsion gripped him. He had to go there. He had to see it for himself. Without thinking, he stumbled toward the hill, his legs nearly giving way beneath him. The fog seemed to press him closer, shrouding the town in a heavy, suffocating embrace. His breath hitched as he passed the old cemetery gates. The ground was soft underfoot, the damp earth sucking at his boots. His body was beginning to feel numb, the burning in his skin intensifying as though the plague was digging deeper into him. And then he saw it. The monument stood tall at the center of the graveyard, a grand stone structure, covered in overgrown ivy and moss, its surface weathered with time. But it wasn't the monument that caught his eye. It was the grave in front of it, the fresh grave. The earth was still loose, as though it had been disturbed recently. The soil was dark, almost black, as though it had been soaked in something unnatural. Samuel felt the cold fingers of dread tighten around his heart. His breath quickened, and for a moment he could almost hear the faint whispers again, rising from the ground, rising from the grave. Understand. The words echoed in his mind, and without realizing it, he found himself standing over the grave, staring at the disturbed earth. He had to know. He had to dig. With shaking hands, Samuel began to claw at the ground, the soil giving way beneath his fingers. The more he dug, the more frantic he became. The earth seemed to resist, as if trying to push him back, but he couldn't stop. His chest burned, his body screamed in pain, but he continued. He needed to understand what had been buried here. Finally, his hands hit something cold, something hard. He gasped for air, pulling at the object buried beneath the soil. It was a box, old and weathered, bound in rusted iron. He could feel the weight of it, the presence of something ancient trapped inside. His heart raced as he pried the box open. And there, nestled within, was a single decayed object, a small carved figurine. A dark, twisted figure of a man, wrapped in chains, his eyes hollow, his mouth open in a silent scream. Samuel recoiled in terror as the fog seemed to close in around him, suffocating him. He could hear the whispers now, louder than ever, echoing in his ears. The curse had been awakened, and now it was coming for him. His last thought, as the darkness consumed him, was of Dr. Isaac Harper's final warning. It will spread until it finds a new vessel. And now that vessel was him. The world around Samuel blurred, his vision clouded with a growing darkness that seemed to swirl like the fog itself, suffocating him. His breath came in ragged gasps, his pulse pounding in his ears as the whispers around him grew louder, more insistent, as if the earth itself was calling out to him. The ancient plague that had been locked away for centuries was waking up, and it had found a way to reach him. He clutched the figurine in his hand, its sharp edges digging into his palm, grounding him for just a moment before the pain started again. His chest burned, the rash that had begun on his arms now creeping across his neck, his face, his chest. Every inch of his skin felt like it was being consumed by fire, and yet, at the same time, it was so cold. He trembled uncontrollably, the tremors rattling his bones. Samuel staggered back, barely managing to keep himself upright as the ground beneath him seemed to sway, the fog swirling like a living thing, wrapping itself around him. He heard the whisper again, clearer this time, and as he turned he saw something, or someone, standing just beyond the graveyard, obscured by the mist. A figure, tall, thin, its features indistinct, like a shadow. "Samuel," it whispered, the voice slithering into his mind, colder than the night air. He froze. The figure's voice was familiar, but he couldn't place it. It felt like a dream, or a nightmare, but it wasn't. It was real. It had to be. The name it spoke, his name, echoed in his mind with a weight he couldn't shake. "Come closer," the figure crooned, its voice like a soft melody woven into the wind, pulling him in. His legs moved of their own accord. No longer did he feel the burning pain in his chest. Instead, there was only the hollow ache in his limbs, the cold emptiness that gnawed at his insides. Every step felt as though he was walking in water, his body moving slower, heavier, as if something were trying to hold him back. But still he moved forward, drawn by the sound of that voice, that pull. The figure stood near the edge of the cemetery now, half covered in the mist. Its shape was more defined, its long limbs stretched unnaturally tall. It was humanoid, but wrong, its proportions twisted. It wore something dark, perhaps a cloak, perhaps the remnants of flesh, and it stood in silence, watching him approach. As Samuel drew nearer, the ground beneath him seemed to shift, as though the very earth was stirring, awakening something long forgotten. The air was thick, heavy with the stench of decay. His stomach lurched, but still he couldn't stop himself. The figure tilted its head, and Samuel froze, the intensity of its gaze making his chest tighten. It didn't speak at first. Instead, it seemed to study him, its hollow eyes boring into his soul. "You have awoken it," it said softly, its voice rasping like dry leaves. "The plague, the curse, the thing that sleeps beneath, and now it will claim you." Samuel's heart raced in terror. The words echoed in his mind like the reverberation of an old bell. He opened his mouth to speak, to protest, but no words came out. His throat was tight, as if something were pressing against it, constricting it. His body felt foreign to him now, as though he was no longer in control. The figure reached a long, spindly hand toward him, its fingers unnaturally long, covered in a sickly gray skin. It brushed against his cheek, the touch sending a shock of cold straight through him. He shuddered, recoiling from its touch, but the figure's grip was unyielding. It pulled him closer, the smell of death more potent now, suffocating him. "You are not the first," it whispered, "nor will you be the last. The vessel must always be filled." Samuel gasped, the words hitting him like a slap. Vessel. It had all started with that. The plague needed a vessel, and now it had found one in him. His body, no longer his own, burned with fever, the rash spreading faster, darker, like ink in water. His pulse pounded in his temples as he fought to break free of the figure's grasp. But it was useless. The figure's eyes glowed faintly now, a sickly, yellowish hue, and its mouth split into a twisted, hollow grin. The ritual, it continued, its voice filling his mind like a chant. It must be completed. Only then will it be free. Suddenly, Samuel's mind flashed back to the ritual of return. He remembered the symbols on the parchment, the images of the dead rising, the dark figure, the chains. But now they seemed to blur together, as if he was losing his grip on reality. What was the ritual supposed to do? What had they unleashed? What had he unleashed? In the distance, he could hear the faint echoes of chanting, soft at first, but growing louder with each passing moment. The sound was coming from the lake. He turned, his head swimming, his body weak and trembling, as if he was sinking into the earth itself. The lake, the place where it all began. The figure tilted its head again, its smile widening. "Go," it urged, its voice growing louder. "The ritual must be completed. You cannot stop it." Samuel's legs moved, almost involuntarily, toward the lake, his eyes fixated on the rippling water ahead. The mist grew thicker, swirling around him, as though the world was folding in on itself. The chants grew louder, their words a dark lullaby, pulling him closer to the water's edge. As he approached, he saw the outline of a figure standing by the water, silhouetted against the pale moonlight. It was a man, or at least it had been. His body was thin, skeletal, his eyes sunken deep into their sockets. His clothes were tattered, as if he had been in this place for ages, and yet there was something oddly familiar about him. Samuel's breath caught in his throat as the man turned to face him. It was Dr. Isaac Harper, but there was something wrong. His eyes were hollow, his skin pale and stretched tight over his bones. His lips barely moved as he spoke, his voice low and raspy. "It's too late," Dr. Harper rasped. "You have brought it back. It is awake now." Samuel opened his mouth to speak, but again no words came. His chest tightened painfully, his body racked with pain. The figure of Dr. Harper gestured toward the water. "Look," the figure said. "Look at what you have awakened." With trembling hands, Samuel peered into the lake, and for the first time he saw it. Rising from the depths of the water, something massive stirred. It was a shape, a shadow, something ancient and unfathomable. Its eyes glowed a sickly yellow, matching the figure's. It was moving slowly toward the shore, its body an undulating mass of water and shadow, its mouth wide, its teeth sharp and jagged like the edge of broken glass. The plague, the thing that had been waiting, buried beneath the earth, beneath the waters for so long. And now it was free, and Samuel, the vessel, was its first victim. The whispers grew louder, more frantic now. The air was thick with the smell of death, and the coldness sank deeper into his bones. His body burned as if it were being consumed from the inside out, the rash now dark and spreading like an infection. His thoughts blurred, his vision faltering. The plague had taken root inside him, and it would not stop. It would never stop. The figure behind him grinned, its hollow eyes burning with dark satisfaction. "Welcome," it whispered, "to the end." Samuel's heart hammered in his chest, the rhythm erratic and desperate. His body felt like it was betraying him, his limbs heavy and uncooperative, as if each step he took toward the water was dragging him further into the abyss. The lake's surface rippled in eerie patterns, the shadows beneath it shifting with a slow, deliberate menace. The figure of Dr. Harper stood silently, watching him, his expression twisted in a grotesque mockery of sympathy. The air around Samuel grew thick with the scent of decay, the smell so powerful that it choked him, drawing a nauseous, sharp gasp from his throat. The plague, the ancient, forgotten curse, was no longer something distant in history. It was here, now clawing at his soul. He could feel it in every fiber of his being, as if the very air around him was turning poisonous, sinking into his skin and bones. He stumbled toward the water, not knowing if his steps were his own, or if they were being guided by some unseen force. The whispers in his ears had become a maddening chorus, each voice more insistent, more hungry than the last. "Come closer," they hissed. "The ritual is not complete. You must finish it. Only then will the plague be sated." His breath came in short, desperate bursts, his mouth dry as dust. Samuel reached the edge of the lake, the water eerily still, as if it were holding its breath. He looked down, and there, just beneath the surface, he saw it, the thing that had been waiting for centuries, awakening from its slumber. Its eyes, a sickly yellow, stared back at him, glowing from the depths like lanterns in the dark. The creature's shape was monstrous, too vast to be fully comprehended by his mind, but he could see the jagged, shark-like teeth that gleamed in the murky water, and the undulating mass of its form, something both organic and unnatural at once. The whispers urged him closer, and though Samuel's body fought against it, he found himself unable to turn away. His hands shook violently, and yet, with trembling fingers, he reached for the book that had started it all, the book of the ritual. He hadn't wanted to believe in it at first. The stories, the warnings, the strange symbols he had uncovered, it had all seemed like myth, superstition. But now, standing at the edge of the forgotten plague, he knew the truth. He opened the book, its pages stiff with age, its ink faded but legible. The words were in a language he didn't fully understand, yet the meanings were becoming clearer by the moment. As he traced the arcane symbols with his finger, the whispers grew louder, more frantic, urging him to complete the ritual. The world around him seemed to warp, the night thickening, as if the very fabric of reality was being torn apart. The trees loomed like dark, twisted sentinels, their branches reaching toward him with gnarled fingers. Suddenly he heard the sound, low at first, but unmistakable. The thing beneath the water was stirring, its massive form moving through the depths, causing ripples to spread outward. The lake seemed to tremble, as if reacting to the presence of the creature below. Samuel's mind screamed for him to stop, to turn away, but his hands moved on their own. They clenched the book tighter, the weight of it now more unbearable than ever. His vision began to darken, a terrible dizziness overtaking him as the lake's water started to rise slowly, curling toward him like a hungry mouth. The figure of Dr. Harper stepped closer, his skeletal hand reaching out and placing a cold, bony grip on Samuel's shoulder. "Do it," Dr. Harper whispered, his voice as dry as the wind. "Do it before it is too late. Complete the ritual. The plague needs a vessel, and you have already begun the process. You cannot undo it." Samuel's mind was swirling, his thoughts scattered like leaves in a storm. Every word that had been spoken to him, every warning he had ignored, every detail he had overlooked, crashed down on him in a devastating wave. He knew, now, what the ritual was truly for. It wasn't meant to banish the curse, to stop the plague. It was meant to unleash it, to set it free so it could consume. "No," Samuel gasped, his voice breaking. I don't want this." But even as he said the words, his body betrayed him. His hands flipped through the book's pages, faster now, searching for the final incantation. The whispers surged in volume, a cacophony of voices all screaming in unison, urging him to hurry. The water was rising, creeping higher, its surface beginning to churn. Samuel's eyes flickered toward the depths of the lake, where the monstrous shape below was coming closer, rising to the surface. The creature was almost upon him now, its enormous, scaled body moving with terrifying speed. He closed his eyes, trying to block out the horror around him, but the whispers were inside his mind now, relentless and deafening. His skin burned, his chest tight with the weight of the plague consuming him from the inside out. He could feel it, the sickness spreading through him, the infection turning his blood to ice, his thoughts to fog. The words on the page became clearer, an invocation, a call to whatever ancient evil had been sealed beneath the lake. Samuel's hand hovered above the page, his fingers twitching. He had no choice now. He was already part of the ritual, already the vessel. With a final, desperate breath, he spoke the words aloud, and the earth trembled. The ground shook violently beneath his feet, the lake roaring as the creature beneath the surface surged forward. Samuel stumbled backward, nearly losing his footing as the mist thickened around him, the air heavy with the smell of rot. The surface of the water erupted in a violent explosion of foam, and something massive broke through, its dark, writhing form rising above the lake like a great serpent. Its eyes locked onto him. He could feel it, the ancient presence, the curse, the plague. It was awake, and it was free. In that moment, everything collapsed. The ground beneath Samuel's feet cracked open, the earth giving way as the lake surged forward in a final, devastating wave. The whispers rose to a deafening crescendo, filling his mind, his soul drowning him. His body, already ravaged by the plague, seemed to wither beneath the water's touch, his limbs growing heavy, his breath shallow. The creature, the plague, had claimed him, and with that final act, it was free to spread. The town that had once been forgotten, its memory erased by time, now lived on only in whispers. Its destruction had been inevitable, just as it had been for Samuel, and the curse would remain, waiting for the next soul to disturb its slumber, to awaken the plague once more. The following morning, the sun rose sluggishly over the horizon, its pale light casting long shadows over the remains of the town. The woods stood still, silent as if holding their breath, and the lake was eerily calm, its surface reflecting the dark sky like a mirror. No one would ever know what had truly happened, the horrors that had been unleashed. The plague, once forgotten, now lived again. But far from the lake, in the heart of the nearest city, life continued as it always had. People went about their daily routines, oblivious to the horrors that had been awakened just miles away. And yet, something lingered in the air, a sense of unease, a shadow that cast itself over the land. It was faint at first, like the whisper of a breeze or the faintest echo of a warning long forgotten. But as the days passed, it grew stronger, impossible to ignore. In the dusty corner of a local library, a young historian named Emma was working late into the night. She had come across a strange collection of papers, a series of old letters, journals, and records detailing the history of the town Samuel had researched. She had been intrigued by the strange references to the plague, a sickness that had ravaged the town over a century ago. It seemed to be another forgotten chapter in history, a mysterious event that had been buried and erased over time. But as Emma read on, she began to feel the same sense of dread that had gripped Samuel all those months ago. The words on the yellowed pages told a story of sickness and death, of people succumbing to a plague unlike any the world had seen before. It spread quickly, wiping out entire families, entire neighborhoods. But what struck Emma most were the last entries, written in frantic, scrawled handwriting. "It's here. We've awakened it. The plague is not a disease, it's a curse. We are the vessels, and it has returned to claim us. No one is safe." Emma's hand trembled as she turned the page, her eyes scanning the words. She felt a chill creep up her spine, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. There was something wrong with this, something off about the way the words seemed to echo in her mind. She reached for the next journal, the final one, hoping for some clue, some explanation that would tie it all together. But as she opened the journal, a foul stench hit her like a wave, a rancid, rotting odor that filled the room. Emma recoiled, her breath catching in her throat as she looked around, the library suddenly feeling too small, too suffocating. Her gaze returned to the journal, her fingers moving instinctively over the pages, even as her stomach churned. The last entry, written in an unfamiliar hand, was brief. "We tried to stop it. We failed. The plague is inside me, inside all of us. It is spreading. It will never die." The words seemed to bleed into each other, as if the ink was sinking into the very paper, leaving behind a stain that could never be removed. Emma slammed the journal shut, her heart pounding in her chest. She wiped her brow, trying to steady her breath, but the stench lingered in the air, heavy and oppressive. She had to get out, had to leave. The library suddenly felt too close, the shadows too thick, pressing in on her from all sides. She grabbed her bag and made for the door, but before she could reach it, something caught her eye. A flash of movement, someone standing just outside the window. The figure was tall, thin, shrouded in shadow, and for a moment, Emma couldn't breathe. She froze, her eyes locked onto the figure, her pulse racing. The figure was staring directly at her, unmoving. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished, leaving nothing but darkness behind. Emma stumbled back, her hand gripping the edge of the desk for support. She felt dizzy, nauseous, her head spinning. It wasn't just the figure. It was the feeling that had settled into her bones. The same sense of sickness, the same unease she had felt as she read through Samuel's records. Something was wrong. Something was happening. She didn't waste another second. She bolted from the library, the cool night air hitting her face like a slap. But even as she ran down the dark streets, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was following her, lurking just out of sight. Every rustle of leaves, every flicker of light felt like a warning. Emma didn't know what was happening, but she knew one thing for sure: the plague wasn't over. It had never left. In the distance, back at the lake, the water churned once again. The surface rippled, as if something just beneath it was stirring, waking, rising. The ancient creature that had long been sealed beneath the earth had felt the disturbance, the incantation that had been completed, the ritual that had been set in motion. It had been bound to the lake for centuries, bound by the desperate efforts of those who had tried to contain it. But now the curse was spreading. The figure that Emma had seen outside the window was just the beginning. It was not a man nor a woman, but something far darker. Its eyes were hollow, its skin pale and withered. It was a being of plague, an incarnation of disease, sent to reclaim what had been lost. It moved in shadows, in whispers, its presence seeping into the very air around them. Emma reached her apartment, her breath ragged and uneven, her pulse racing. She fumbled for her keys, her hands shaking uncontrollably. The door opened, and she slammed it shut behind her, locking it with a frantic twist of the key. She leaned against the door, trying to steady herself, her heart still pounding in her chest. But even as she did, she felt it, the creeping sensation that the plague had found her. She felt the faintest tremor in her fingertips, the coldness that was spreading through her body, and in the stillness of the room, the whispers began. The whispers were faint at first, like the soft rustling of paper in a breeze, but they grew louder, more distinct, and far too clear to ignore. Emma turned her head toward the source of the sound. At the window, the same dark figure she had seen earlier now stood, peering through the glass. Its hollow eyes stared at her, unblinking, its lips unmoving as the whispers began to take form. "You cannot escape." The voice was low and jagged, as if it had crawled from the depths of the earth. A chill swept through Emma's body, seizing her heart with an icy grip. She tried to back away, but her feet felt rooted to the ground. The room seemed to close in on her, the walls pressing in, the air growing thicker with every breath she took. She stumbled backwards, her legs weak, her mind clouded with confusion and fear. The whispers echoed in her ears, relentless, like a swarm of insects. She reached for her phone, hands trembling, and dialed the first number that came to mind. Her friend, David, the one who had helped her when she first discovered the town's history. She needed help, she needed answers. But as the phone rang, the whispers intensified, as if the very air in the room was charged with some unseen force. The dark figure outside the window remained motionless, its eyes locked on her, and Emma couldn't bring herself to look away. When the phone finally picked up, David's voice came through, but it was distorted, as if muffled by something far away. "Emma," David said, his voice distant, uncertain. "David, something's happening. There's something here." Emma's voice cracked with terror. She could feel it, the sickness crawling beneath her skin, taking root. Her vision blurred, her thoughts scattered. "It's the plague, it's back. It's inside me." The line went silent for a moment, but then David's voice returned, trembling. "Emma, you need to listen to me. There's no time. Whatever you're seeing, whatever you think is happening, it's real. You're not just sick, you're becoming." Before he could finish, the phone went dead. The call had cut off, leaving Emma with nothing but the growing feeling of dread that seemed to fill the room. Her head pounded, her pulse quickened, and she felt the overwhelming urge to vomit. She looked at her hands. They were trembling, covered in cold sweat, and the skin on her fingers had begun to blister, tiny red sores that burned with a strange intensity. She gasped, stumbling backward, only to feel a strange pressure on her chest, as if something invisible was tightening around her lungs. She couldn't breathe. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, pressing into her skull. The figure outside the window moved, its shape becoming more defined in the dim light. Its lips stretched into a grotesque smile, and its eyes, those deep, hollow pits, became impossibly wide, staring into her very soul. "You are one of us now." Emma backed away from the window, desperate to escape, but there was no escape. The room had become a cage, the walls closing in around her, the floor shifting beneath her feet. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her hands clutching her throat, the air thick with the stench of rot and decay. She couldn't take it anymore. She had to leave. She had to get out. With a sudden burst of energy, Emma ran toward the door, her fingers fumbling with the lock. The whispering intensified, a maddening cacophony that filled her ears and drowned out everything else. She finally managed to open the door and rushed outside, desperate for air, desperate for freedom. The moment she stepped outside, the chill in the air hit her like a slap. The streets were empty, the city silent, as though the world had forgotten how to move. But the figure, no, the presence, was still there. It followed her, moving in the shadows, always just out of sight, its whispers never stopping. She stumbled through the streets, not knowing where she was going, not caring. The disease had already spread through her, taking control, and she felt herself growing weaker with every step. Her legs wobbled, her skin burned, and she felt her heart pounding in her chest like a drumbeat. But it wasn't her heart anymore. It was something else. She heard a scream. It was distant but unmistakable, her own voice. And then another scream, and another, as if others, too, were being claimed by the plague. She wasn't alone in this. There were others who had been touched by the curse. She finally made it to the edge of the city, where the streetlights flickered like dying stars. The ground beneath her feet began to tremble, and the air smelled of something foul, like wet earth and decay. In the distance, she saw the lake. The dark, still waters stretched out before her, as ominous as ever. Her mind screamed for her to turn away, to run in the other direction, but her feet carried her forward, drawn to the water, drawn to whatever had been awakened. And then she saw it. At the water's edge, the figure was standing, waiting for her. But now there was no mistaking it. It was a creature, not human. Its skin was ashen, stretched too tight over a skeletal frame. Its eyes were hollow pits, black as the void, and its mouth, oh, its mouth was wide and jagged, dripping with something dark. It was the plague, the curse, the thing that had been unleashed. Emma felt her knees buckle as she collapsed to the ground, the weight of the disease pulling her under. She had seen it all, the history, the warning signs, but it was too late. The plague had taken root in her, and it was going to take everything. The creature stepped closer, its eyes gleaming with hunger, and Emma felt the cold fingers of death wrap around her heart. "You are one of us now," it whispered, its voice 1,000 times more horrifying than before. And then, with a final guttural scream, Emma was swallowed by the darkness, the plague completing its final task, spreading its curse to one more soul. The lake remained still, as though nothing had ever happened. The winds had died down, and the air was thick with the scent of decay, but it was the kind of decay that never quite left. It lingered, hanging in the air, never fading. And as the sun set once more, casting a red glow over the water, the whispers echoed again, this time from the depths. The forgotten plague had returned, and this time it would never be forgotten again. The lake lay still, its surface like black glass, reflecting the fiery red sky above, as if the heavens themselves were stained by the plague. The winds had picked up again, whipping the dry leaves into spirals, carrying with them a scent of rot that seemed to seep from the earth itself. The town remained eerily quiet, save for the distant howls of creatures unseen, a low, mournful sound that seemed to echo from every corner of the town. Beneath the surface of the lake, something stirred. The water rippled in slow, deliberate movements, as if the very depths of the earth were waking. The dark shape of the creature, Emma's tormentor, disappeared beneath the waves, vanishing into the blackness of the lake. But even as it submerged, its presence lingered, a shadow upon the land, feeding on the fear that hung thick in the air. Back in the town, the streets were nearly deserted. The few people who remained had already begun to show signs of the plague, twitching limbs, deep coughs, and fevered eyes. They moved in a daze, their minds lost, their bodies betrayed by the disease that had slowly worked its way through their veins. A small group of them gathered near the square, drawn to the whispers that seemed to vibrate through the very ground they walked on. Among them was David. He had been trying to reach Emma, his thoughts consumed by worry after the phone call had cut off. He had no idea what was happening to her, but he could feel it. The air was thick with something unnatural, and it made the hairs on his neck stand on end. "Emma," he whispered under his breath as he walked toward the center of town. His footsteps echoed in the empty streets, as though the town itself had been abandoned. His heart raced. He didn't know what he expected to find, but he couldn't just sit there waiting. Something was terribly wrong. As he passed the old town square, the ground beneath his feet trembled. A low, resonant hum seemed to emanate from the earth itself, shaking him to his core. He stopped and looked around, his breath shallow. The air felt heavier now, charged with an unseen force, as though the world was on the edge of something terrible. And then he heard it, the whispers. At first, they were faint, like the murmurs of people talking just out of earshot. But the voices grew louder, sharper, like 1,000 voices speaking in unison. It was an unbearable sound, scraping at his mind, filling his ears with a cold, oppressive presence. David, he froze, his heart skipping a beat. The voice wasn't just in his mind. It was real. It was coming from the center of town. "Emma," he called, stepping forward cautiously, his footsteps faltering. There, in the center of the square, he saw it, a dark figure standing at the base of the old fountain. It was too still, too silent, as if it were waiting for him. His pulse quickened, his instincts screaming at him to run, but his feet were planted firmly to the ground. The figure remained unmoving, yet he could feel its eyes on him. The cold emptiness of its gaze seemed to pierce through him, as though it could see into his very soul. "Emma," he said again, his voice trembling. But no answer came. The figure did not move. Instead, the air around it seemed to distort, shimmering with an unnatural light. The whispers around him grew louder, their words unintelligible, but the tone, there was something familiar about it. Something that clawed at the edges of his memory. Then, with a sudden, violent jerk, the figure's head turned toward him. David gasped, his breath catching in his throat. The face of the creature was twisted, its features distorted, a grotesque mockery of humanity. Its mouth opened wide, too wide, and the sound that emerged was not a voice, but a low, guttural growl, an inhuman sound that vibrated through his chest. "You shouldn't have come back." The whisper was impossibly clear now, as if it had been right beside him all along. David stepped back, his heart pounding in his ears. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was seeing, but all he could do was turn and run. He had to get out. He had to. But before he could take another step, the ground beneath him buckled, and the earth cracked open with a deep, bone-shaking roar. He screamed, stumbling backward, as the earth split apart in jagged lines, sending a wave of dark, oily water flooding the streets. The water, black as ink, gushed from the fissures in the earth, rising fast, swirling like a tide that had never been seen by human eyes. The whispers intensified, becoming a shrieking chorus, the sound growing louder and more frantic. The flood swept through the town, washing over buildings, swallowing homes, filling every alleyway. David watched in horror as the dark water rose higher and higher, drowning the square. The creature, the plague, was rising, awakening from the depths, bringing with it an ancient terror that could not be stopped. He ran toward the nearest building, a crumbling structure that looked like it had been abandoned for years. The water was too close now, its surface rippling with an unnatural force. He slammed his shoulder against the door, breaking it open, and stumbled inside, gasping for air. The whispers followed. No matter where he went, they were there like a constant, oppressive hum in the back of his mind. He could feel them pressing against his skull, pushing their way into his thoughts. "David," the voice called again, too clear, too close. He turned and saw a figure standing in the doorway of the building. Emma. But it wasn't her. Not anymore. Her body was twisted, her face pale, her eyes wide and empty. Her mouth was stretched into a grin that wasn't hers, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too many. The whispers filled the room, becoming deafening. "Join us." The flood of water surged into the building, surrounding him, rising to his waist. David backed away, panic rising in his chest as the water pressed closer. The walls seemed to pulse with life, the dark energy of the plague sinking deep into the bones of the town. He couldn't escape. "Join us, David." And then, with one final, terrifying scream, David was pulled beneath the dark water. The whispers swallowed him whole, his body dragged down into the depths, where the plague waited, where it would claim him just as it had claimed all the others. And in the distance, far beneath the surface, the whispers continued. carrying with them the curse of the forgotten plague, ready to spread once more. The water settled. A heavy silence hung over the town, as if the very air itself had been tainted. The distant sounds of the flood's retreat faded into nothingness, leaving only the stillness. The once bustling streets were now lifeless, drowned beneath the ink-black flood. Buildings that had stood for centuries were now crumbling ruins, their foundations weakened, their walls coated with the eerie slickness of the black water. The plague's curse had spread far and wide, its reach immeasurable, its grip unyielding. Beneath the surface, the town was still. David's body lay at the bottom of the dark lake, his eyes wide, staring at nothing. His limbs were stiff, his mouth frozen in a silent scream. The whispers did not cease. They circled him, a maddening chorus, a constant presence that only grew louder with each passing moment. "David! David!" The voice was low and soothing now, the tone almost familiar. His mind, though barely conscious, strained to make sense of it. He tried to open his mouth, but nothing came out. His chest refused to move, his body a hollow shell, trapped beneath the crushing weight of the water. The whispers continued, tugging at the edges of his consciousness. "You're not alone." He felt the pressure in his chest, an unnatural weight, and a searing heat that coursed through him from the tips of his fingers to the top of his skull. His vision flickered. Through the dark water he saw them. Shadows, figures that loomed just out of reach, their faces obscured by the depths, their outlines shifting, rippling like the surface of a disturbed lake. They moved closer, circling around him. Each one was impossibly tall, their features disfigured, like something stitched together from fragments of nightmares. Some had hollow eyes, others faces that were nothing but gaping mouths, wide and unblinking, their teeth sharp and jagged. "Welcome." The voice came again, clearer now, as if the very water itself spoke. The shadows reached out, their fingers brushing against his skin. Cold, lifeless fingers that sent jolts of pain coursing through his body. It was as if they were pulling him closer, drawing him into their eternal embrace, into the depths of the forgotten plague that had consumed the town. But David could not escape. The last thing he remembered was the sensation of sinking deeper, the cold fingers gripping him tighter, the whispers louder, blending together into one monstrous, consuming sound. Up on the surface, the town remained still. A dark fog hung over the lake, rolling across the water like a suffocating blanket. The sun had set, but no stars shone through the sky. The once vibrant town was now a shadow of its former self, the streets empty, the houses abandoned. Even the sounds of nature had fallen silent, as if the land itself was holding its breath. A lone figure stood at the edge of the lake. Emma had returned. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow, as if she had seen something that no human should ever witness. She stared at the water, the dark liquid reflecting the red sky. The whispers still echoed in her mind, the voices calling to her, urging her to join them. They had been persistent, relentless, clawing at her thoughts ever since the ritual had been performed. She had heard David's final screams, felt his presence slip away into the dark water. The plague had claimed him, just as it had claimed the others. The curse of the forgotten plague had spread once more, just as the records had warned. But now Emma could feel it. Something was changing. She turned, her eyes scanning the abandoned town. In the distance, she saw figures moving through the fog, their shapes barely distinguishable against the mist. The shadows had come back, and they were not just in the water anymore. The ground beneath her feet trembled, and the air grew colder, as if the world itself was waking. The whispers grew louder, more desperate, until they were a roar in her ears. They beckoned her, called her name. "Emma!" She shuddered, clutching her chest, as if trying to hold herself together. Her body trembled with the weight of the curse, her mind teetering on the edge of madness. She knew what was happening, what had to be done, but her own body betrayed her. It had already begun. She staggered back, her breath shallow, and looked at the lake one last time. And then she saw it. A hand, reaching up from the water. It was blackened, withered, its skin stretched tight against the bones, and its fingers long and twisted. It grasped at the surface, pulling itself up with a grotesque slowness, the sound of the water churning around it like something alive. More hands followed, rising from the dark depths, clawing their way through the water, dragging with them the weight of the forgotten plague. Emma fell to her knees, her mind slipping into darkness. The whispers drowned out her thoughts, and she could feel the sickness creeping up her throat. Her skin began to burn, her body twitching in spasms as the curse took hold. She gasped for air, but there was no air left to breathe, only the suffocating darkness of the plague. With one final scream, she collapsed, her body falling forward into the lake. The dark water closed over her, and the town was silent once more. The lake remained still. The figures, the shadows, the whispers, they had all gone. The town had fallen into the grip of the forgotten plague, just as it had before. And beneath the water, the curse continued to grow. The whispers would never stop. They would echo through the streets of the forgotten town forever. And those who dared to uncover the truth would become part of it, just as the historian had, just as Emma and David had. They would sink into the depths, swallowed by the plague, their names lost to time. And when the next fool came to seek the truth, the water would rise once again, dragging them into the eternal darkness. The forgotten plague would never be forgotten. It would never be free. And that's the end of tonight's stories. Keep listening to the sound of rain and fall into a deep, peaceful sleep.